My son stole $250,000 from me and kicked me out on the street. He thought he left me with absolutely nothing. So I sold his luxury house out from under him while he was at work. What he discovered later left him completely devastated. Before I tell you how I served this cold revenge, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful family member a hard lesson. My name is Leon. I am 69 years old. I worked my whole life as a mechanic to give my son Kendrick a better life. I thought I raised a man. I raised a vulture instead. The heavy oak front door swung open with a sharp, violent crack. Two worn leather suitcases flew out from the foyer, hitting the wet, muddy grass of the front lawn with a heavy thud. Heather, my white daughter-in-law, stood in the doorway with a twisted sneer on her face. She dusted her hands off quickly as if she had just taken out the garbage. Kendrick, my own flesh and blood, stood right behind her with his arms crossed firmly over his chest. He looked down at me from the porch steps with absolute disdain. "You are a burden, old man," Kendrick spat, his voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "We have our own life to live now. We cannot have a freeloader dragging us down anymore. Find a shelter or a park bench. I do not care. Just get off my property." He tossed my spare set of house keys into a deep puddle near my work boots. The metal splashed, sinking straight into the mud. I looked at the boy I had fed, clothed, and protected for 35 years. He did not flinch. He did not blink. Heather slammed the door shut so hard the large windows rattled in their frames. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place loudly. I was locked out of the house I helped buy. I did not yell. I did not bang my fists against the expensive mahogany wood, begging them to let me back inside. Panic is a luxury for people who have someone to catch them when they fall. I had no one. I quietly bent down, picked up my two battered suitcases from the wet grass, and wiped the mud off the sides. I pulled out my phone and ordered a rideshare. The rain started to drizzle, a cold and biting Texas autumn rain, but I stood perfectly still on the curb until the gray sedan pulled up. I loaded my bags into the trunk and slid into the back seat. The driver asked if I was okay. I gave a single nod and told him to drive to the cheapest motel he could find on the south side of town. As the car merged onto the busy highway, the harsh reality of the situation demanded immediate practical action. I needed to book a room for at least a week. I needed to figure out my exact budget. I opened the banking app on my phone to check the balance of the joint retirement account Kendrick and I shared. The loading circle spun for a few agonizing seconds. Then a red error message flashed across the bright screen. Insufficient funds. I frowned, tapping the screen aggressively to refresh the page. I thought the application was glitching due to the bad weather or a poor cell signal. The page reloaded. Account balance $0.00. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. I clicked on the transaction history tab. Right there at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, a single outgoing wire transfer had cleared the bank. $250,000 had been moved to an external untraceable crypto exchange account, the exact amount of my entire life savings. The account was completely drained. Kendrick had not just kicked me out of the house. He had financially gutted me with surgical precision. He waited until the bank opened, moved every single penny of my retirement money, and then threw my bags onto the lawn. My breathing stopped for a fraction of a second. A normal man would have suffered a massive heart attack right there in the back of the rideshare. A normal father would have broken down into hysterical tears, crushed by the ultimate betrayal of his only child. But I did not cry. The initial shock evaporated instantly, replaced by an absolute freezing ice in my veins. The betrayal was so deep, so calculated, that it burned away any lingering affection I held for my son. He wanted to play a ruthless game of survival. He did not realize I had written the rulebook decades before he was born. That $250,000 was not just money. It was my blood, my sweat, and my tears. It was the hard-earned profit from selling the old house I had owned for 40 years. The house where I worked double shifts at the auto shop to pay the mortgage. The house where Kendrick grew up safely. 3 years ago, Kendrick came to me with a tearful plea. He and Heather wanted to buy a massive luxury home in a gated community, but they could not afford the hefty down payment. He promised me that if I sold my home and pooled my money with theirs, I would have a permanent place to live. He swore on his mother's grave that they would care for me in my old age. He said we would be a real family. I trusted my son. I handed over the cash. I moved into their spare room. I became their live-in handyman, their silent provider, and eventually their discarded trash. That sacred promise was now just another piece of garbage rotting in their pristine yard. The rideshare pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a rundown motel with flickering neon signs. I paid the driver with the cash I kept folded in my wallet, grabbed my heavy suitcases, and checked into a dingy room on the first floor. The room smelled intensely of stale smoke and damp carpet. I placed my bags on the sagging mattress. Anyone else would have felt defeated. Anyone else would have called the police in a blind panic, crying about a stolen retirement fund and begging for help. I did not do that. I unzipped the main compartment of my oldest suitcase. I bypassed the neatly folded shirts and trousers. I felt along the bottom fabric lining until my fingers found a hidden zipper cleverly sewn into the thick seam. I unzipped the false bottom and reached inside the secret compartment. I pulled out a thick waterproof envelope. I broke the wax seal and extracted a pristine stack of legal documents. The top document bore the official red seal of the county clerk's office. It was the master deed to the luxury mansion Kendrick and Heather were currently celebrating inside. I ran my calloused finger over the ownership line. The printed name on the official deed did not say Kendrick. It did not say Heather. When I handed over the money 3 years ago, my late wife Gwen's final words echoed vividly in my mind. Never hand the keys to your life to anyone else, Leon, not even your own son. I had listened to her wise warning. I had quietly structured the purchase agreement with the original seller behind closed doors. Kendrick was too arrogant and too lazy to read the fine print of the complicated contracts he eagerly signed. He thought he bought a house. He actually just signed a restrictive rent-to-own lease agreement. The legal undisputed owner of that $500,000 property was a corporate entity named Leon Holdings, LLC. I am the sole director and owner of that company. I own the ground they walk on. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct number to my cutthroat real estate lawyer. I had barely finished mapping out my strategy when the sun broke over the horizon. The harsh morning light cut through the grime on the cheap motel window, illuminating the dust dancing in the air. My phone buzzed aggressively against the chipped laminate of the nightstand. I checked the caller ID. It was Heather. I swiped the screen to answer and brought the speaker to my ear without uttering a single word. A sharp, high-pitched laugh pierced the heavy silence of my room. "Well, well, well," Heather sneered, her voice dripping with venomous amusement and absolute arrogance. "Did the old man survive his first night in the gutter, or have the stray dogs already claimed you? I hope you found a cozy cardboard box to sleep in, because the weather report says it is supposed to freeze tonight." Her cruel laughter echoed again, loud and grating, forcing me to pull the phone slightly away from my ear. She was reveling in my perceived misery. She called just to make sure I was suffering. She wanted to hear my voice break. She wanted to hear the sound of a defeated man begging for scraps. I took a slow, controlled breath. I kept my breathing shallow, deliberately, making myself sound frail, broken, and exhausted. "Yes, Heather," I rasped, letting my voice crack perfectly. "I am here. It is very cold." "That is just too bad," she mocked, not a single ounce of genuine pity in her tone. "But you will be absolutely thrilled to know your money is being put to much better use than sitting in some dusty retirement account. Kendrick was so smart to move it quickly before you could try any funny business. You know that $250,000 you were hoarding? Kendrick dumped a massive chunk of it into a new cryptocurrency project this morning. He says the market is incredibly bullish right now, and it will triple our investment in less than a month, and the rest of your little life savings. Well, let us just say we finally got the lifestyle upgrade we deserve." Through the phone speaker, I could hear the deep, guttural revving of a high-performance engine. "Hear that, Leon?" she yelled over the roar of the exhaust. "That is a brand-new Porsche Cayenne, custom-stitched leather interior, midnight black paint job, and fully loaded. Kendrick bought it for me in cash right after we kicked you out yesterday. The salesman at the dealership treated us like absolute royalty when we walked in with that kind of liquidity. It rides a whole lot smoother than that piece of junk-rusted truck you drive around. We are headed to a champagne brunch right now to celebrate our new financial freedom and our beautiful home. So do not expect us to answer if you try calling back crying." I closed my eyes and smiled a cold, calculating smile in the empty motel room. She was practically handing me the rope to hang them both, wrapping it tightly around her own neck. I needed her to feel completely in control, absolutely invincible, so I dug deep into my acting skills and played the pathetic role she expected from me. "Heather." "Please," I whispered, forcing a pathetic, desperate tremble into my vocal cords. "I do not care about the luxury car or the crypto investments. Just let Kendrick have the money. He can keep all of it. But please, I need my heart medication. I left the prescription bottles in the bathroom cabinet upstairs. If I do not take my pills, I could have a real medical emergency. Just wire me $1,000. That is all I ask. Just $1,000 from my own account so I can go to the pharmacy and buy my pills to stay alive. Please, Heather, tell my son I am begging him. Tell him his father needs help. Her response was swift and merciless. Are you actually kidding me? She scoffed, her voice turning sharp and entirely disgusted. You think we are running a charity for washed-up mechanics? You should have thought about your expensive medication before you became such a miserable, useless burden to us. Drink some tap water and take a nap, old man. We are completely done paying for your pathetic existence. If you call this number again or show up at our house, I will personally file a police harassment charge against you. Have a nice life, Leon. The line went dead with a sharp click. She hung up on a man she truly believed was having a medical emergency. I slowly lowered the phone to my lap. My heart was not failing. It was beating with the steady, relentless, and powerful rhythm of a war drum. Heather had always despised me with a burning passion. From the very first day Kendrick brought her to my old house for dinner years ago, she looked at me like I was something she had just scraped off the bottom of her expensive designer shoes. She hated my calloused working hands. She hated the permanent grease stains under my fingernails and the deep scars I earned working inside hot engines for 4 long decades to put her husband through college. She was a woman who believed her upper-class white heritage made her fundamentally superior to a rugged blue-collar black man. She only tolerated my presence in her pristine mansion because my hard-earned money paid for its very foundation. She demanded I use the back entrance so I would not track invisible dirt on her white carpets. She treated me exactly like a hired servant who had overstayed his welcome in a place he built. She thought my silence over the past 3 years was pure submission. She mistook my fatherly patience for stupidity. The facade of the weak, sickly old man vanished instantly into the stale motel air. I sat up straight on the edge of the sagging mattress, my posture rigid, my mind sharper and more focused than it had been in years. The pity party was officially over. I opened my contacts and tapped the name of my attorney, Gregory. He answered on the very first ring. Gregory. I said, my voice steady, deep, and commanding. It is Leon. The situation has escalated rapidly. Kendrick made his move just like we anticipated. He transferred the entire $250,000 out of the joint account yesterday morning. He pushed it into a cryptocurrency exchange and just bought his wife a brand new Porsche in cash. Gregory let out a low, sharp whistle through the receiver. That is a massive, unrecoverable mistake on his part, Leon the lawyer replied smoothly, the thrill of the hunt evident in his voice. Did he execute that massive transfer without your written authorization? I confirmed he did. Then we drop the hammer right now, Gregory stated with absolute legal authority. Moving $250,000 across state lines into untraceable crypto accounts without the joint account holder's explicit consent is not just a messy civil dispute between family members. That is a textbook case of federal wire fraud. It carries a mandatory prison sentence. I am contacting the bank's Central Fraud Department and the FBI Financial Crimes Division immediately. We are activating the emergency reporting protocol right this second. By the time your son finishes his little champagne brunch, his entire financial world will cease to exist. Do exactly what we planned, Gregory the Furrer instructed coldly. Burn it all down to the ground. The federal asset freezing order bypassed the local branch managers and went straight to the bank's central security mainframe. Every single account tied to Kendrick's social security number was flagged locked and frozen within minutes. The trap had successfully snapped shut around his ankles. I ended the call with Gregory and reached for my laptop. I connected to the spotty motel Wi-Fi and opened a new email draft. I typed in the direct address for Apex Properties, a notorious real estate buyout firm famous for purchasing properties in cash and executing ruthless evictions with zero mercy. I attached the master deed of the luxury house to the email, hit send, and waited for the absolute chaos to begin. Less than 2 hours after I sent that email with the attached deed, I was sitting inside the sleek downtown office of Apex Properties. The room smelled faintly of expensive cigar smoke, sharp cologne, and stale coffee. It was a space designed purely to intimidate the weak. Dark mahogany walls, heavy leather chairs, and a distinct lack of personal photos or warm touches made it clear that humanity did not exist here. Sitting across from me was Camille. She was a senior acquisitions director known in local real estate circles as an absolute corporate shark. She wore a tailored gray suit and looked at me with cold, calculating eyes that assessed my net worth before I even spoke. Apex Properties did not care about family drama. They did not care about sob stories or domestic disputes. They cared exclusively about buying distressed or deeply discounted assets with liquid cash and flipping them for massive profits. They were notoriously ruthless when it came to clearing out stubborn tenants and reclaiming properties. That made them the exact people I needed for this job. Camille did not offer me water or ask how my day was going. She simply tapped her perfectly manicured nails against the heavy oak desk and stared at the printed documents I had laid out between us. She was waiting for the catch. Camille adjusted her reading glasses and meticulously scrutinized every single page of the master deed and the original purchase agreement. She traced her finger over the signature lines, her sharp eyes scanning for any hidden legal traps that might complicate a swift cash buyout. I watched her read, knowing exactly what she was going to find. "My son is a highly arrogant man," I explained, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "He operates under the assumption that he is the smartest person in any room he walks into. When we bought this luxury property 3 years ago, I brought the contracts to him for his signature. He was so eager to show off his new mansion to his country club friends and his shallow wife that he did not bother to read past the first page. He just grabbed a pen and signed exactly where I pointed." Camille looked up from the paperwork, a slow and genuinely impressed smirk forming on her bright red lips. "He signed a rent-to-own residential lease agreement," she stated, her voice laced with predatory amusement. "He does not hold a single percentage of equity in this property." "That is exactly right," I confirmed without blinking. "Kendrick believes he is paying off a traditional bank mortgage every month. In reality, his monthly payments are nothing more than high-premium rent deposited directly into the corporate accounts of Leon Holdings, LLC. I am the sole managing member and director of that limited liability company. Kendrick is legally classified as a standard month-to-month tenant with a future option to buy at the end of a 10-year term, an option that I can legally void if the tenant fails to maintain the property or engages in fraudulent criminal activity." Camille flipped to the final page of the contract, her eyes widening slightly at the airtight legal language my lawyer Gregory had drafted years ago. "He really did not read a single paragraph, did he?" she asked rhetorically, almost laughing at the sheer stupidity of the situation. "Not a single word," I replied smoothly. He saw the shiny brass keys, he saw the massive square footage, and his massive ego completely blinded him to the legal reality of the transaction. He handed me the ultimate power to evict him whenever I saw fit, and he gladly paid me for the privilege of doing so. Camille leaned back in her high-backed leather executive chair. She steepled her fingers together and studied me with a newfound professional respect. "So, Mr. Leon," she said briskly, moving straight to the business at hand, "you hold the absolute unencumbered title to a pristine 5-bedroom mansion in a highly desirable gated community. There are no secondary liens and no complicated family trust disputes holding up a transfer. Why are you sitting in my office offering to sell it to an aggressive cash buyout firm instead of putting it on the traditional open market for a higher yield?" I looked out the large glass window of her office, watching the busy city traffic move far below. My mind briefly flashed back to a quiet hospital room many years ago. My beautiful wife Gwen was lying in a sterile bed, her hands frail and cold as she held mine for the very last time. She knew our son better than anyone else in the world. She saw the underlying greed and the toxic entitlement growing inside Kendrick long before I was willing to admit it to myself. "Do not ever hand the keys to your life to anyone else. Leon," she had whispered, her voice weak but her warning crystal clear and absolute. "Not even your own son. You have to protect yourself when I am gone because he will look out only for himself." I had carried those heavy words with me every single day since she passed away. Setting up the LLC was my way of honoring her final wish. It was my ultimate safety net against my own blind, fatherly love. I built a legal fortress around my assets just in case Kendrick ever tried to discard me. I turned my attention back to Camille, the memory fading into the cold reality of the room. "I am selling it to you because I do not have the time or the patience for traditional real estate showings," I told her flatly. "I want out today." I slid a formal proposal across the heavy wooden desk. "I am willing to sell this property to Apex Properties right now for exactly 20% below the current market value." That gives your firm an immediate six-figure equity buffer the second you sign the paperwork. You can wire the funds into my newly secured account by the end of business today, and the house is entirely yours." Camille looked at the proposed purchase price, and her eyes gleamed with pure, unadulterated corporate greed. A 20% discount on a pristine luxury asset in that specific high-end neighborhood was practically unheard of. It was an absolute steal, and she knew it instantly. However, I continued leaning forward and planting my hands firmly on the edge of her desk. "There is one non-negotiable condition attached to this severe financial discount. You take legal possession of the property today and you execute an immediate eviction protocol. The current tenants are hostile and they are illegally occupying the premises. I want your most aggressive removal team dispatched to that address immediately. I want them thrown out on the street." Camille let out a sharp, confident laugh. "We specialize in hostile evictions, Mr. Leon. We have a dedicated legal team and contracted private security personnel who handle squatters and problem tenants every single day. If we close this deal right now, those occupants will be served with a mandatory notice before the sun goes down today." She reached into her heavy desk drawer and pulled out a thick stack of blank transfer documents and a high-quality silver fountain pen. "Let us get this closed," she said eagerly. I took the silver pen and signed my name on the dotted line, officially transferring the luxury mansion to Apex Properties. The ink dried instantly, permanently sealing Kendrick's fate. The transaction was completely finalized in less than an hour. I stood up, shook Camille firmly by the hand, and walked out of the cigar-scented office with a profound sense of absolute liberation. The heavy weight of the last 3 years had vanished from my shoulders. While I was stepping into the elevator to leave the building miles away in a high-end upscale restaurant, Kendrick was loudly laughing with his friends. He casually signaled the waiter and tossed his premium platinum credit card onto the silver tray to cover a massive $2,000 champagne bill. The waiter smiled politely and took the card to the point-of-sale machine at the bar. A moment later, the machine beeped a loud, sharp tone. Transaction declined. Account frozen. The catered champagne brunch was in full swing inside the sprawling living room of the luxury mansion. Kendrick and Heather were hosting their most pretentious friends to celebrate what they loudly called their new era of absolute freedom. They had hired a private bartender and a high-end catering team to serve premium caviar and vintage French champagne. Heather fluttered around the room in a brand-new designer dress, practically glowing with the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she had just secured her financial future without working a single day for it. She laughed loudly, clinking crystal glasses with her guests, blatantly bragging about their sudden, massive wealth. Kendrick stood by the marble kitchen island holding a flute of champagne, aggressively boasting to his country club buddies about his sudden genius investment in the cryptocurrency market. The music was loud, the laughter was incredibly fake, and the sheer arrogance in the room was suffocating. They thought they had successfully discarded the old man who built their entire foundation. They thought their flawless crime was a complete success. But reality was about to crash through their expensive front door with the destructive force of a runaway freight train. The head waiter of the catering staff approached Kendrick with a polite but extremely tight smile. He carried a sleek black leather folder containing the final invoice for the afternoon's extravagant services, a total of $2,450. Kendrick did not even bother looking at the itemized receipt. He casually pulled his premium platinum credit card from his designer wallet and tossed it onto the folder, with a theatrical flick of his wrist ensuring all his friends saw the heavy metal card. The waiter nodded, stepped away to the mobile point-of-sale terminal resting on the dining table and inserted the chip. A sharp, loud beep cut through the ambient jazz music. Declined. The waiter frowned, wiped the chip on his apron, and tried again. Beep. Declined. Sweating slightly under the pressure of the wealthy crowd watching him, he swiped the magnetic strip as a final desperate attempt. Beep. Transaction failed. Do not honor. The waiter walked back to Kendrick, leaning in close to whisper discreetly, "Sir, I am so sorry, but your card is not going through. Do you happen to have another form of payment?" Kendrick scoffed, loudly rolling his eyes as if the catering company's equipment was completely beneath him. "Your machine must be broken," he snapped condescendingly. "Run it again. It has a $50,000 limit." The waiter stood his ground, his face flushing. "I ran it 3 times, sir. The terminal specifically says the issuer has locked the account." Kendrick snatched the card back, his face turning a deep shade of crimson as a few of his friends stopped talking to watch the awkward exchange. He pulled out his phone, his thumb jabbing aggressively at the screen to call the elite customer service line for his bank. He expected a groveling apology from a bank representative. He expected them to instantly unlock his funds and offer him reward points for the inconvenience. Instead, he was forced to listen to generic hold music for 3 agonizing minutes while his friends watched him sweat. When the line finally clicked, he immediately launched into a tirade. "Listen to me. I am a premier client, and I demand you unfreeze my card right this second," Kendrick barked, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. But he was immediately routed to the automated fraud prevention department. A stern robotic voice informed him that his call was being transferred to a federal compliance officer. When a human finally answered, the voice was completely devoid of customer service warmth. "Mr. Kendrick," the bank officer stated flatly, "we are legally prohibited from authorizing any transactions on your accounts. As of 9 o'clock this morning, your entire financial portfolio has been frozen under a federal mandate. The FBI Financial Crimes Division has flagged a suspicious domestic wire transfer of $250,000 originating from a joint account. We are currently cooperating with federal investigators regarding a suspected wire fraud case, specifically a grand larceny charge involving the unauthorized depletion of a senior citizen's retirement fund. Until the investigation is concluded by federal authorities, you have absolutely zero access to any funds, credit lines, or physical assets tied to this institution." Kendrick's jaw dropped. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling fingers, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces against the pristine hardwood floor. Kendrick had always lived his entire life spending other people's money. Since his teenage years, he operated under the dangerous delusion that wealth was something you simply took, not something you earned through grueling decades of physical labor. He never saw the late nights I spent covered in motor oil repairing broken engines just to afford his expensive college tuition. He possessed an incredible degree of financial ignorance masked entirely by his expensive tailored suits and smooth-talking corporate buzzwords. He honestly believed that transferring $250,000 from a joint retirement account to an offshore crypto exchange was as simple as moving $20 between personal checking accounts. He thought the transaction was instant, irreversible, and completely untraceable. He had zero fundamental understanding of federal banking regulations. He did not realize that moving massive sums of money without the explicit consent of the primary account holder triggered immediate anti-money laundering protocols. In his extreme arrogance, he assumed I would just roll over, accept my fate on the street, and die quietly. He never factored in the devastating power of the American legal system when it is unleashed by a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. The loud shattering of the crystal glass silenced the entire room. The upbeat jazz music suddenly sounded completely out of place. His pretentious friends exchanged uncomfortable, whispering glances, slowly setting their expensive drinks down on the marble counters. Heather rushed over her face, a mask of panic and embarrassment, demanding to know what was wrong. Kendrick ignored her completely. He shoved past his wife, ignoring the confused and judging stares of his guests, and locked himself inside the downstairs guest bathroom. His hands were shaking violently as he dialed my phone number. He paced back and forth in the confined space, breathing heavily like a cornered animal. I was sitting comfortably at a quiet cafe across town, sipping a dark espresso when his name flashed on my screen. I answered the call, letting the silence stretch to assert my absolute dominance. "You miserable old bastard," Kendrick screamed into the phone, dropping his polished corporate persona entirely. His voice was a frantic, terrified shriek. "What did you do to my accounts? Call the bank right now and tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you authorized the transfer. Call off the FBI. Do you have any idea what you have done? I could go to prison. The feds are involved." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot espresso. The bitter taste matched my mood perfectly. "I did exactly what I promised I would not do when you were a child," I replied, my voice as cold and hard as a steel blade. "I stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own actions. You stole my life savings, Kendrick. You committed a federal crime the second you forged my digital authorization to drain that account. You threw me out into the rain like an unwanted dog. You wanted to play the role of a ruthless man, but you forgot that American law does not spare thieves no matter how expensive their suits are. You are entirely on your own now." I ended the call without giving him a single second to respond. I blocked his number instantly, severing the last digital thread that connected me to the man I used to call my son. Back at the mansion, Kendrick stared at his dark phone screen in absolute terror, his chest heaving with panic. Before he could even begin to process the grim reality that he was facing federal prison time, the heavy brass doorbell echoed loudly throughout the house, cutting through the tense silence of the ruined party. He opened the bathroom door and walked unsteadily to the foyer. Standing on the front porch was a stern man wearing a black uniform. The man did not knock again. He simply slapped a bright yellow legal document directly onto the center of the pristine mahogany door. Kendrick yanked the heavy mahogany door open, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble threshold. The stern man in the black uniform was already walking briskly down the driveway, completely ignoring him. Kendrick reached out and ripped the bright yellow paper off the expensive wood. The heavy adhesive tore with a sharp, aggressive sound that echoed in the quiet foyer. He stared at the document, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically across the page. Printed at the very top in bold black uppercase letters were the words that would officially end his life of luxury. 72-hour eviction notice from Apex Properties. Kendrick blinked rapidly, shaking his head, trying to process the impossible words staring back at him. The legal notice stated clearly that the current occupants were residing on the premises illegally and were required to vacate the property immediately. It warned in strict legal terms that local law enforcement would be dispatched to physically remove all persons and personal belongings if the residence was not entirely empty within 3 days. Kendrick felt his knees go weak. His lungs struggled to pull in air. He looked back at his confused party guests in the living room and then down at the paper again. This had to be a sick joke. He was the homeowner. He bought this mansion. He was a successful financial investor. People like him did not get eviction notices plastered on their front doors. He frantically pulled out his phone and dialed the corporate contact number printed at the bottom of the yellow notice. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped the expensive device on the hard floor. A woman answered on the second ring. Her voice was sharp, professional, and entirely devoid of human empathy. Apex Properties. Camille speaking. Kendrick exploded. He paced aggressively in the foyer, screaming into the receiver with no regard for the guests listening in the next room. "Who do you people think you are?" he roared, his voice cracking with panic and rage. "You just slapped an eviction notice on my front door. I own this house. I have the paperwork. I am going to sue your entire company into bankruptcy for harassment, trespassing, and emotional distress. I demand you send that messenger back here to apologize right now before I call the police." Camille did not raise her voice. She did not interrupt him. Instead, a low, chilling chuckle echoed through the phone. It was the sound of a corporate shark who had dealt with hundreds of desperate, delusional people just like him. "Mr. Kendrick," she replied with icy precision, her tone cutting right through his hysterical threats. "You do not own anything. You are currently trespassing on private property legally acquired by Apex Properties this morning. I highly suggest you lower your voice, stop making empty legal threats, and start packing your bags." Kendrick sputtered, his face turning a deep shade of purple with uncontrollable rage. "That is an absolute lie," he shouted, veins bulging in his neck. "I signed the closing papers 3 years ago. I am the legal owner of this estate." Camille sighed heavily, sounding profoundly bored by his sheer ignorance and lack of legal comprehension. "You really are exactly as foolish as the previous owner described," she stated flatly, twisting the knife deep into his ego. "I just sent an email to your primary address. Open it right now. Read the document you actually signed 3 years ago instead of just looking at the shiny keys." Kendrick pulled the phone away from his ear and opened his email application. A new message from the Apex Legal Department was waiting for him. He clicked the attached PDF file with a trembling thumb. It was a scanned copy of his original housing contract. He scrolled past the first page and stared at the bold legal heading. It did not say warranty deed. It did not say mortgage agreement. It said residential rent-to-own lease agreement. His eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror. Camille's voice crackled through the speaker once more, sealing his fate. "As you can clearly read, you are legally classified as a standard long-term tenant. The original owner retained full authority to terminate your lease agreement upon the sale of the property. We bought the house today. Your lease is officially terminated. You have exactly 72 hours before the county sheriff arrives to throw you and your designer furniture onto the street. Have a productive weekend packing." She hung up the phone, leaving Kendrick listening to the dial tone. Kendrick stood completely frozen in the grand foyer. He stared at the PDF document on his glowing screen, his mind struggling to comprehend the massive, crushing financial humiliation he had just uncovered. For 3 entire years, he had been paying $4,000 every single month. He firmly believed he was paying off a traditional bank mortgage. He thought he was building immense equity and securing his long-term wealth. He scrolled down to the payment terms section of the highly restrictive contract. The designated payee for his monthly housing payments was not a national bank. The recipient was clearly listed as Leon Holdings, LLC. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a physical blow to the stomach. Every single cent he had paid to live in this luxury mansion went straight into a corporate account owned and controlled entirely by his father. He never owned a single brick window or door of this massive estate. He was nothing more than a low-level tenant paying premium rent to the very man he had thrown out into the rain that morning. His father had orchestrated the most brilliant, brutal financial trap imaginable, and Kendrick had walked right into it with a smug, arrogant smile on his face. He had been brutally outsmarted by the blue-collar mechanic he had looked down upon his entire life. Heather stormed into the foyer, the heels of her shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her face was flushed with anger and intense embarrassment. The wealthy party guests in the living room had gone completely silent, awkwardly watching the dramatic scene unfold from the couches. "What is going on?" Kendrick Heather demanded, her voice shrill and demanding, echoing painfully in the large space. "Why are you screaming on the phone like a maniac? What is that yellow paper on our door?" Kendrick could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his eyes glued to the digital contract on his screen. Heather snatched the phone directly out of his trembling hands. She looked at the screen. She read the eviction notice. Then, she read the strict lease agreement. The grand illusion of her wealthy, superior lifestyle shattered instantly into a million irreparable pieces. She realized she was not the wealthy lady of a high society mansion. She was the wife of a fraudulent broke man who was about to be completely homeless in 3 days. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "You told me we owned this house," she screamed at the top of her lungs, no longer caring about their social image. "You told me we were rich and powerful. Now the FBI has frozen our bank accounts and we are getting evicted like common criminals." The wealthy guests in the living room began setting their expensive champagne flutes down and quietly grabbing their designer coats, eager to escape the humiliating, toxic scene. Heather did not care who was watching them fall apart. She stepped forward, raised her hand high, and slapped Kendrick across the face with a resounding, vicious crack. The sound echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. Kendrick stumbled backward, holding his stinging red cheek, his pride and his life completely destroyed in a matter of hours. Directly across the street, seated outside a small, upscale coffee shop, I watched the entire chaotic scene unfold. I held a small porcelain cup in my calloused hands and took a slow, satisfying sip of my dark, bitter espresso. Through the large, pristine bay windows of the mansion, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of their absolute destruction. I watched Heather strike Kendrick with all her might. I watched their pretentious, fake friends fleeing out the front door, shielding their faces, desperate to distance themselves from the sinking ship. I watched my arrogant son collapse onto the floor of a house he would never own, his hands covering his face in pure despair. A cold, victorious smirk spread across my face. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The revenge I had served was flawless. The trap had closed exactly as I had designed it years ago. They had tried to ruin my life, but I had simply taken back what was mine. I finished my espresso, leaving a generous tip on the table, and watched the two people who had betrayed me tear each other apart through the glass window. A few hours later, I was sitting in a dimly lit blue-collar diner on the edge of town. I was enjoying a simple plate of roast beef and a slice of thick sourdough bread, savoring the quiet atmosphere. Suddenly, the bell above the diner door jingled with extreme violence. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded against the cheap linoleum floor, disrupting the peace. Before I could even reach for my coffee cup, Kendrick stormed over and slammed both of his hands down onto my small table. The heavy impact rattled my ceramic plate and sent my silverware clattering loudly. His expensive designer suit was completely wrinkled. His silk tie was ripped off, and his face was a portrait of unhinged desperation mixed with blind, arrogant rage. He leaned in close, completely ignoring the startled looks from the waitress and the few truck drivers eating nearby. "I am calling the police right now," Kendrick hissed, his voice vibrating with absolute fury and spit flying from his lips. "You committed massive real estate fraud. You tricked me into signing a fake lease, and you illegally sold my home behind my back. The cops are going to lock you away for the rest of your miserable life, you manipulative old psychopath. Give me back my house and call off your corporate lawyers, or I am dialing 911 right this exact second. You messed with the wrong man." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I simply picked up a piece of my sourdough bread, took a slow, deliberate bite, and chewed it thoroughly while maintaining absolute unbroken eye contact with the furious, sweating man standing over me. I swallowed, wiped the corners of my mouth with a cheap paper napkin, and calmly reached into the inner breast pocket of my heavy jacket. I pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of paper and placed it face up on the table, sliding it right between Kendrick's trembling hands. "Go ahead," I said, my tone perfectly, even and terrifyingly cold. "Call the police. In fact, skip the local precinct and ask them to patch you directly through to the FBI Financial Crimes Division. I am absolutely sure they would love to see that document in your hands." Kendrick looked down. It was a certified bank printout of the $250,000 wire transfer he had executed that morning. But this was not just a simple digital receipt. It was the internal authorization form the bank required for joint accounts, complete with a digital signature stamp. There, boldly stamped on the bottom authorization line, was my signature, a signature I absolutely did not write. A signature Kendrick had illegally forged using an old electronic document to bypass the security holds and steal my money. The color drained from his face entirely. His mouth opened and closed silently like a suffocating fish out of water. The aggressive, threatening posture he had walked in with completely evaporated, replaced by the sheer naked terror of a man staring directly into the abyss of his own making. "Do you know what happens when you electronically forge a primary account holder's signature to drain a federally protected retirement fund?" I asked, my voice cutting through the diner like a razor blade. "It is not a simple domestic dispute, Kendrick. It is not a civil misunderstanding that goes away with an apology. It is legally classified as federal wire fraud and grand larceny. You moved $250,000 across state lines into a cryptocurrency exchange without my legal consent. The federal mandatory minimum for exploiting a senior citizen's protected retirement asset and committing wire fraud is 10 years in a federal penitentiary. 10 years of your life gone. You will not be wearing custom Italian suits. You will not be driving luxury sports cars. You will be wearing an orange jumpsuit, sharing a concrete cell with violent felons, and your precious Wall Street career will be permanently destroyed. The bank has already confirmed the IP address used to forge my signature matches your home network. You left a digital trail a mile wide because you were too arrogant to cover your tracks. You thought you were stealing from an ignorant old mechanic. Instead, you handed me the exact weapon I needed to utterly destroy your life." I watched him crumble under the weight of his reality, feeling absolutely no sympathy in my heart. For years, I had shielded him from the harsh consequences of his reckless, selfish behavior. "When you were 20 years old," I reminded him, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that made him flinch, "you got drunk and brutally assaulted a man outside a nightclub. He was hospitalized, and he was going to press serious criminal charges that would have ruined your entire life before it even started. Do you remember what happened next? I emptied my emergency savings account. I paid $50,000 in legal settlements and hush money to keep you out of a jail cell. I worked myself to the bone, ruining my hands and destroying my back with double shifts just to ensure your record stayed clean so you could get that fancy finance job. I bought your freedom with my own sweat and blood. I showed you mercy because you were my son. But that toxic pity ends today. You took my protection for granted. You mistook my fatherly sacrifice for weakness. I am entirely done paying for your mistakes. I am done being your safety net. You are a grown man, and you are going to face the absolute wrath of the federal law completely on your own." The realization of his impending doom finally shattered the last remaining pieces of his massive ego. His legs gave out entirely. Right there in the middle of the greasy, crowded diner, Kendrick collapsed. The wealthy, arrogant finance executive dropped to his knees on the dirty linoleum floor, completely abandoning his pride. He crawled forward and wrapped his arms tightly around my legs, burying his face against my denim jeans. He began to sob uncontrollably, letting out loud, pathetic, heaving wails that drew disgusted stares from the waitress and the other patrons. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice muffled and thick with snot and tears. "I am so sorry. I was stupid. I was greedy. Heather was pressuring me for more money to maintain our image, and I panicked. I will give it all back to you. I will drain the crypto account right now and wire every single cent back to you today. I will pay you back double with my salary. Just please do not let the FBI take me away. Do not let me go to federal prison. I will do absolutely anything you want. Just call the bank right now. Tell them you authorized the transfer. Tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. And please call your corporate lawyers and cancel the sale of the house. Heather and I have nowhere to go. We are going to be completely homeless by tomorrow. I am your son. Please do not do this to me." He clung to my legs like a frightened, desperate child, his hot tears soaking through the tough fabric of my jeans. He was completely stripped of his arrogance, begging for his life, pleading for the very mercy he had brutally denied me just 24 hours ago when he threw my bags into the rain. He thought a few pathetic tears and hollow apologies could erase the ultimate betrayal. He thought he could manipulate my fatherly heart one last time. He was dead wrong. I did not reach down to comfort him. I forcefully pulled my legs free from his desperate grip and stood up towering over him as he groveled pathetically on the filthy floor. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a crisp $5 bill and tossed it onto the table to cover my coffee and bread. I looked down at him with eyes as cold as a winter grave. "Cancel the sale," I repeated softly, my voice devoid of any warmth. "I sold it yesterday for cash. Tomorrow morning the trash removal team arrives to throw you and your wife out on the street. Enjoy the rain." The next morning arrived with a thick blanket of gray clouds hanging low over the gated community, a perfect reflection of the storm I had unleashed. I sat comfortably in my rented sedan, parked discreetly down the street, holding a fresh cup of dark coffee, waiting for the show to begin. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the heavy rumble of diesel engines shattered the quiet suburban neighborhood. 3 massive box trucks bearing the bold black and yellow logo of Apex Properties pulled up to the curb, parking aggressively across the perfectly manicured lawn of the mansion. A crew of 8 burly men dressed in matching dark uniforms jumped out of the vehicles. They did not ring the doorbell. They did not wait for a polite invitation. The crew leader marched straight up to the custom mahogany front door, pulled out a heavy steel crowbar, and smashed it directly into the expensive brass lock. The metal shattered with a loud crunch and the door swung wide open. The removal team swarmed into the house like a highly coordinated military strike unit moving with absolute ruthless efficiency. The 72-hour notice had expired. The immediate chaos inside the house was deafening, bleeding out into the quiet street for everyone to hear. Heather's shrill, panicked screams echoed from the second floor as the crew began systematically dismantling her pristine life. Within minutes, the front door became a conveyor belt of luxury goods being forcefully ejected from the premises without a single shred of mercy. A custom white Italian leather sofa, a piece Heather had endlessly bragged about, was shoved unceremoniously through the entryway. The crew did not care about the delicate fabric. They dragged it over the threshold, scraping the expensive leather against the door frame before dumping it directly onto the damp, muddy grass. Next came the massive 85-inch flat-screen television carried by 2 men who deposited it roughly next to a pile of expensive silk throw pillows and shattered crystal vases. Heather ran down the grand staircase, still wearing her silk pajamas, her hair a wild, frantic mess. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, clawing at the broad shoulders of the crew members, desperately trying to stop a man from carrying out her massive collection of designer shoes and handbags. They ignored her completely, treating her like an annoying ghost as they continued their relentless work. Kendrick stumbled out of the master bedroom, his face pale and eyes wide with frantic terror. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, screaming to the dispatcher that a gang of armed robbers was invading his home and destroying his property. Less than 5 minutes later, 2 local police cruisers with flashing red and blue lights skidded to a halt in the driveway. Kendrick ran toward the officers, frantically pointing at the removal crew and demanding they draw their weapons and arrest everyone on the spot. But the officers did not rush into the house with their guns drawn. They walked calmly toward Camille, the Apex Properties acquisition director, who had just stepped out of a black sedan parked behind the box trucks. Camille smiled a cold, practiced smile and handed the lead officer a thick manila folder. It contained the certified eviction mandate, the stamped proof of ownership, and the terminated rent-to-own lease agreement bearing Kendrick's own signature. The officer carefully reviewed the documents, nodding slowly as the legal reality became undeniably clear. He handed the folder back to Camille and turned to face Kendrick. "Sir," the officer stated firmly, resting his hand on his utility belt. "This is a lawful court-ordered eviction. The corporate entity known as Apex Properties is the sole legal owner of this estate. Your tenancy has been officially terminated. You have 0 legal right to be inside that structure. I am ordering you to step back and remain on the public sidewalk immediately. If you attempt to re-enter the house, interfere with the removal crew, or cause any further disturbance, you will be placed in handcuffs and arrested right now for criminal trespassing." The flashing police lights and the relentless echoing shouting had drawn the attention of the entire wealthy neighborhood. For the past 3 years, Heather had treated these people with unbearable condescension. She had gossiped about their landscaping, criticized their choice of vehicles, and constantly bragged about her own superior wealth at every community association meeting. She made sure everyone knew she considered herself the queen of the cul-de-sac. Now the very neighbors she had so proudly looked down upon were standing on their front lawns and sidewalks watching her absolute destruction unfold. They did not rush over to offer help. They did not look at her with any sympathy. Instead, one by one, they pulled out their expensive smartphones. They held their devices up, hitting the record button to capture every single humiliating second of Heather standing barefoot in the mud, crying over her discarded designer possessions. The women she had insulted at the country club were now zooming in on her tear-streaked face, securing permanent digital evidence of her spectacular downfall. She was completely exposed, a fraudulent socialite stripped of her fake crown, reduced to a pathetic public spectacle for the neighborhood to enjoy. The Apex removal crew operated with terrifying mechanical speed. They were not paid to pack items delicately into labeled cardboard boxes or wrap fragile items in bubble wrap. They were paid to clear the structural footprint by any means necessary, leaving nothing but bare walls and empty floors behind. Within exactly 1 hour, the sprawling 5-bedroom mansion was completely and utterly gutted. Every piece of custom artwork, every velvet chair, every heavy oak dining table, and every single piece of high-end clothing had been violently dragged out and tossed into a chaotic, towering mountain of debris on the front lawn. The sky above them remained a dark, gloomy gray, the heavy clouds threatening to unleash a torrential downpour on their unprotected, expensive belongings at any given moment. The front door was slammed shut with a resounding finality, and a heavy steel padlock was immediately installed over the handle by the Apex security team. A massive bright orange sign warning against illegal entry was nailed directly into the pristine wood. Kendrick stood completely paralyzed on the edge of the public sidewalk, his polished dress shoes sinking into the wet dirt. He stared blankly at the massive pile of his worldly possessions scattered carelessly across the wet grass like garbage at a landfill. He looked at the empty dark windows of the mansion he had so arrogantly claimed to own just 24 hours ago. His shoulders slumped heavily and his arms hung limply at his sides. The reality of his complete financial and social annihilation had finally anchored itself in his mind. He had absolutely no money, no home, and no power. The grand illusion he had sacrificed his own father to maintain had evaporated into thin air. He was a hollow shell of a man standing in the cold morning wind, staring at the ruins of his own massive ego while I watched from a distance. Just as the crushing silence of defeat began to settle over the scattered ruined debris, the harsh grating sound of a heavy diesel engine roared from the end of the street. A massive, heavy-duty commercial tow truck turned the corner, its amber hazard lights rotating brightly and cutting through the gloom. It bypassed the parked police cruisers and the Apex moving vans driving deliberately over the concrete curb. The heavy truck maneuvered skillfully across the grass, its massive rear hydraulic lift lowering steadily as it backed up straight toward Heather's brand-new midnight black Porsche Cayenne. Heather let out a blood-curdling shriek that completely drowned out the low rumble of the heavy diesel engine. She sprinted barefoot across the slick, muddy grass of the front lawn. Her expensive silk pajamas clung to her shivering frame in the damp morning air, but she did not care about the cold. She threw her body directly between the massive rear dual tires of the commercial tow truck and the gleaming front grille of her pristine Porsche Cayenne. The operator, a massive man wearing a bright yellow reflective safety vest, slammed on his heavy air brakes just in time. The truck halted with a loud mechanical hiss. He hopped out of the cab, raising his hands in a calm, placating gesture to de-escalate the situation. Heather did not care about his safety or her own personal dignity. She lunged at the large man like a cornered feral animal. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails transformed into vicious claws as she furiously scratched at the thick fabric of his heavy vest and swatted wildly at his face. "Get away from my luxury car!" she screamed, her voice hoarse and completely unhinged. "This is a custom vehicle paid for in full." The operator easily deflected her frantic, uncoordinated physical attacks. He stepped back completely unfazed by the hysterical wealthy woman attacking him on a suburban lawn. He reached into his heavy metal clipboard and pulled out a thick stack of official banking documents bearing strict federal seals. "Lady, I strongly advise you to step away from my commercial vehicle right now before I press criminal assault charges against you," the operator warned in a deep, booming voice that echoed across the entire yard. He shoved the legal paperwork directly toward Kendrick, who was still standing completely paralyzed on the edge of the wet sidewalk. "You might want to explain the grave reality of this situation to your wife, sir," the operator stated firmly. "The auto dealership dispatched me to recover this specific asset under direct compliance orders from federal banking authorities." Kendrick felt his stomach drop into a bottomless pit. His wide eyes scanned the top page of the paperwork. The bold red letters spelled out immediate asset seizure. The operator did not wait for Kendrick to find his lost words. He turned back to the hysterical woman blocking his truck and laid out the brutal, undeniable truth for the entire neighborhood to hear. The $250,000 used to purchase this high-end luxury vehicle yesterday morning has been officially flagged by the FBI for severe wire fraud and grand larceny, the operator announced loudly. The funds are legally classified as stolen illicit assets. The exact moment the federal freeze hit your husband's accounts, the auto dealership was notified that the massive cash wire transfer failed to clear the final anti-money laundering compliance checks. The sale contract is entirely null and void. The transaction has been completely canceled by the federal government. This vehicle does not belong to you. It belongs to the dealership, and it is going back to their secure impound lot right now. Heather stopped screaming instantly. Her jaw dropped open as the operator's heavy words finally penetrated her thick skull. Stolen assets, wire fraud, canceled transaction. She turned her head slowly, looking at Kendrick with wide, terrified eyes. She expected him to aggressively deny the horrific allegations. She expected him to step up, puff out his chest, and threaten the tow truck driver with his high-powered corporate lawyers. But Kendrick just stood there like a coward. His shoulders slumped in utter defeat, staring blankly at the wet pavement. Taking advantage of their stunned silence, the operator moved with expert precision. He secured the thick steel hooks under the front axle of the midnight black Porsche. The hydraulic winch whined loudly, lifting the expensive custom-ordered vehicle off the pristine driveway. Heather watched in total silent disbelief as her ultimate status symbol, the physical manifestation of her supposed immense wealth, was hoisted effortlessly into the air. The heavy metal chains clanked and locked firmly into place. The tow truck engine roared back to life, blowing a cloud of dark exhaust into the humid air. Without a second glance at the ruined couple, the operator climbed back into the cab and drove away, taking the $250,000 sports car with him. The driveway was now completely empty. The absolute finality of the departing tow truck shattered the very last remaining illusion of Heather's perfect life. She stood shivering in the damp cold, surrounded by a towering mountain of discarded furniture and ruined designer clothes. She looked at Kendrick, truly looked at him for the first time, and saw exactly what he was. He was not a high society millionaire. He was a fraud. Heather was a highly calculated woman who evaluated every single relationship based strictly on net worth and social climbing potential. She had married Kendrick purely for the extravagant financial status he constantly projected to the world. She only endured his massive arrogance because he provided the mansion, the sports cars, and the unlimited premium credit lines. With that luxurious facade violently ripped away, the true nature of her shallow affection was laid bare for everyone to see. She had zero loyalty to a man with a frozen bank account. She marched through the scattered debris of their ruined life, stepping over broken crystal and ruined velvet cushions. She stopped right in front of Kendrick, her chest heaving with a cold, absolute disgust. "You are completely pathetic," she hissed, her voice carrying clearly to the dozens of neighbors still standing on their lawns with their phone cameras recording every agonizing second. "I did not sign up to be the miserable wife of a homeless felon. You told me you were a financial genius. You told me you built an empire. But you are just a stupid, broke little boy who had to steal from his own elderly father to buy me a car." Kendrick finally looked up, his eyes brimming with pathetic, desperate tears. "Heather, please," he begged, his voice cracking under the intense public humiliation. "We can fix this mess. I can hire a good lawyer. We can start over." "Start over with what?" she screamed, gesturing wildly at the garbage pile on the lawn. "With the wet clothes on your back. You have absolutely nothing. And you are dragging me down with you. I am completely done with you." Heather reached down to her left hand. She grabbed the massive, flawless diamond engagement ring and the matching platinum wedding band. With a violent, aggressive yank, she pulled the expensive jewelry off her finger. She wound up her arm and threw the heavy rings directly at his face. The sharp metal struck his cheekbone with a hard smack before bouncing off into the muddy grass. "I will have my attorney send the divorce papers to whatever federal prison they lock you in," she spat venomously. She grabbed a rolling designer suitcase from the pile and marched away. Kendrick stood completely alone, abandoned by the very woman he had destroyed his own father to impress. He was surrounded by the wet wreckage of his shattered ego. He dropped to his knees in the mud, searching frantically for the discarded diamond ring, his hands scraping blindly through the wet dirt. Before his fingers could find the cold metal, his cell phone vibrated violently inside his damp suit pocket. He pulled it out, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The caller ID displayed the name of the senior managing director at his elite investment firm. Kendrick swiped to answer. Kendrick, his boss, barked, his voice laced with unprecedented urgency and raw anger. "Get to the corporate office right now. The police are waiting in the boardroom." Kendrick did not have his luxury car anymore, so he was forced to beg a passing taxi to take him downtown, his clothes still reeking of wet dog and mud. He walked into the pristine glass lobby of the towering corporate investment building. His custom-tailored suit, once a definitive symbol of his immense status, was now a wrinkled, damp, and filthy mess clinging to his shivering frame. Mud stained the knees of his trousers, and his silk tie was completely missing. The front desk receptionist stared at him in absolute shock as he bypassed the security checkpoint and dragged his heavy feet toward the executive elevators. He rode the elevator to the top floor in suffocating silence, leaving a pathetic trail of dirty footprints on the polished marble floors. When he finally pushed open the heavy double doors of the senior managing director's boardroom, the air inside was absolutely freezing. His boss, an impeccably dressed man who usually praised Kendrick's aggressive sales tactics, stood by the window with a look of pure disgust. Sitting across the long mahogany conference table were not wealthy corporate clients. There were two federal economic police investigators wearing sharp gray suits and displaying shiny gold badges hooked to their leather belts. They stared at Kendrick as if he were a contagious disease. The taller of the two federal agents stood up and placed a thick stack of printed network server logs directly onto the polished boardroom table. Mr. Kendrick, the agent, began, his voice completely devoid of any professional courtesy. "We are with the Federal Financial Crimes Division. We have secured a federal warrant to review the internal network activity of this investment firm." The agent slid a color-coded spreadsheet across the table. Kendrick's hands trembled violently as he looked down at the highlighted rows of data. It was the exact digital footprint of the $250,000 wire transfer he had executed yesterday morning. Kendrick tried to open his mouth to fabricate a lie, but his throat was completely dry. The agent did not let him speak. "You executed a massive unauthorized transfer of funds from a protected retirement account," the agent stated firmly. "But your fatal mistake was not just the theft itself. Your monumental error was executing a fraudulent domestic wire transfer using this firm's secured corporate network and an officially registered company computer. You utilized institutional infrastructure to commit federal wire fraud." Kendrick looked desperately toward his managing director, silently begging for some kind of corporate protection. He expected his boss to call the firm's elite legal team to shield a top-performing asset. Instead, the director slammed his own hands down on the table, his face flushed with unadulterated fury. "Do not look at me for help," the director roared, his voice echoing violently off the glass walls. "You brought a federal financial investigation right to our doorstep. You used our highly regulated servers to steal $250,000 from your own elderly father. You have completely jeopardized the reputation of this entire institution. We have clients calling us in a panic because federal agents are walking through our lobbies." The director pulled a single sheet of paper from his leather portfolio and shoved it aggressively toward Kendrick. "This is your immediate non-negotiable termination of employment," the boss barked. "You are officially fired as of this exact second. You will receive no severance package. You will receive no positive recommendations. Furthermore, our corporate legal department has already contacted the Federal Financial Regulatory Authority. We are filing an emergency petition to have your professional financial licenses permanently revoked. You will never legally trade, manage, or handle another person's money in the United States of America ever again. We are completely severing all ties with you to protect this firm from your disgusting criminal liability." Kendrick felt the last remaining pillars of his entire existence crash down around him. The prestigious career he had built using my hard-earned money was completely obliterated in less than 5 minutes. He had absolutely no defense. The digital evidence was undeniable. He had used the firm's secure portal because he thought it would make the transfer process faster. Instead, it made his guilt absolutely absolute and tied his crime to his employer. The sheer irony of the situation was suffocating. For the past decade, Kendrick had walked through these very hallways acting like an untouchable king. He was notorious for his immense arrogance. He routinely belittled the junior analysts, screamed at the administrative assistants, and openly mocked the janitorial staff who cleaned his spacious corner office. He used to tell anyone who would listen that manual labor was for the weak and the uneducated, completely ignoring the fact that his own father had broken his back in a hot mechanic shop for 40 years just to pay for his fancy university degree. Now the tables had violently turned. The man who used to treat the cleaning staff like invisible garbage was standing in the executive boardroom looking entirely like a piece of trash. His wet clothes reeked of damp earth and stale sweat. His hair was matted to his forehead. His entire aura of superiority was completely gone. He was no longer the golden boy of the financial sector. He was just another dirty, pathetic criminal who had been caught red-handed. His extreme arrogance had officially transformed into a spectacular career-ending joke for everyone in the building to witness. The federal agents did not give Kendrick a chance to pack up his desk or gather his personal belongings. The shorter agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Put your hands behind your back," the agent commanded, stepping forward and physically turning Kendrick around. The cold metal clicked shut around his wrists with a sharp, unforgiving sound that echoed through the quiet boardroom. Kendrick was read his Miranda rights in a fast, monotonous tone. The agents grabbed him firmly by the arms and marched him out of the executive suite. The walk from the top-floor boardroom to the main lobby was the most excruciating journey of Kendrick's entire life. Word of the sudden police raid and his immediate termination had already spread through the corporate grapevine like a massive wildfire. Dozens of employees stepped out of their cubicles and glass offices to watch the spectacle. Junior analysts he had verbally abused, secretaries he had completely ignored, and fellow executives he had ruthlessly stepped over were all standing in the hallways. No one offered a single word of sympathy. No one looked away. They stared at him with pure, unmasked disdain and absolute disgust. Whispers rippled through the crowd of professionals. They pointed at his filthy, ruined suit and his handcuffed wrists. Some of them pulled out their phones to capture the exact moment the arrogant king was dragged away by federal authorities. Kendrick kept his head down, staring at his muddy shoes, unable to meet the eyes of the people he had once lorded over. The glass elevator doors closed, sealing his public humiliation. He was paraded through the main lobby and shoved roughly into the back of a waiting, unmarked federal vehicle right in the middle of the busy financial district. Several hours later, Kendrick was sitting in a freezing holding cell at the federal detention center. He was shivering in his damp clothes, staring blankly at the concrete floor. The heavy steel door finally clanked open. A uniformed police officer leaned into the cell and told him to stand up. "You are incredibly lucky," the officer grunted in a bored tone. "Someone just posted your bail. You are free to go for now." Kendrick felt a sudden massive surge of hope. He assumed Heather had reconsidered, found a way to access some hidden emergency cash and came to rescue him. He rushed eagerly out into the brightly lit waiting room. But the person standing at the front desk was not his wife. It was Gregory, my ruthless corporate lawyer, holding a thick legal briefcase and smiling a predatory smile. Kendrick completely froze in his tracks the moment he recognized the man standing at the front desk of the federal detention center. The overwhelming wave of relief he had felt just seconds ago, thinking his wife had come to bail him out, evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a cold and heavy dread sinking deep into the pit of his stomach. Gregory did not offer a friendly handshake or a comforting word. The ruthless corporate lawyer simply turned and gestured toward a small, private consultation room just off the main holding area. Kendrick dragged his heavy feet, his ruined leather shoes squeaking loudly against the polished concrete floor, and followed the attorney inside. The room was incredibly stark and unforgiving, illuminated by a harsh fluorescent light that buzzed continuously above them. In the direct center of the room sat a cold metal table bolted firmly to the floor. Gregory sat down, smoothed the lapels of his expensive tailored wool suit, and unlocked his premium leather briefcase with a sharp, echoing snap. He did not waste a single second with pleasantries or fake sympathy. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a massive, heavy stack of legal documents bound tightly by a thick black clip. With a deliberate and forceful motion, Gregory pushed the thick contract across the cold metal table. The heavy stack of papers slid to a halt right in front of Kendrick's trembling hands. "Read it carefully," Gregory instructed, his voice echoing fiercely in the barren interrogation room. "But do not take too long. Your freedom has a very strict expiration timer, and my patience is running remarkably thin. Kendrick stared down at the dense legal jargon, his exhausted and terrified mind struggling to process the severity of the text in front of him. "What is this?" He croaked, his throat incredibly raw and aching from the panic of the day. Gregory leaned forward, resting his forearms squarely on the freezing metal surface. "That document is your absolute final exit strategy," the lawyer stated with zero human empathy. "Your father is an exceptionally methodical man, Kendrick. He has authorized me to present you with two very distinct, non-negotiable options today. Option 1 is the disastrous path you are currently walking down. Leon cooperates fully with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. He hands over all the recorded phone calls, the forged digital authorization stamps, and the undeniable concrete proof that you illegally drained a federally protected retirement account. The federal prosecutor takes the case to trial. Given the massive digital footprint you carelessly left behind on your company's servers, you will be found guilty within a matter of hours. You will serve a mandatory minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. You will become a convicted felon with a completely ruined financial record, zero career prospects, and an entire decade to sit in a tiny concrete box thinking about your monumental arrogance." Kendrick swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between the threatening legal documents and the lawyer's completely impassive face. "And option 2, he whispered, terrified of the answer but desperate for a lifeline. "Option 2 is the contract sitting directly in front of you," Gregory explained coldly, tapping the thick paper with his expensive pen. "It is a comprehensive, legally binding voluntary restitution and permanent severance agreement. By signing that document right now, you agree to immediately liquidate any and all assets tied to the stolen $250,000, including your failed cryptocurrency portfolio, and transfer every single remaining cent back to your father's newly secured accounts. Furthermore, you will formally sign away any and all future claims to Leon's estate. You are completely disinherited as of this exact moment. You will never see another dime of his money. The contract also includes a permanent, heavily enforced restraining order. You will never approach your father, you will never contact him by phone, and you will never communicate with him through a third party for the rest of your natural life. If you agree to these absolute crushing terms, Leon will formally recant his federal complaint, classify the transfer as a severe familial misunderstanding, and the FBI will drop the active wire fraud charges. You lose the stolen money, you lose your entire inheritance, and you lose your father forever. But you get to walk out of this police station a free man. Choose your fate right now." Kendrick grabbed his head, his dirty fingers pulling desperately at his damp, matted hair. "How did he plan this so perfectly?" Kendrick muttered, his spirit completely broken. "How did he know I was going to move the money?" Gregory let out a short, cynical laugh that carried absolutely no warmth. "Your father is not a fool, Kendrick. He has been watching you and Heather very closely for a long time. In fact, this specific legal dossier was drafted exactly 6 months ago." Kendrick looked up in absolute shock, his jaw dropping open. 6 months, he repeated, his voice entirely hollow. Gregory nodded sharply. "Yes, 6 months ago your father accidentally intercepted an email on your shared home network between you and a corrupt medical proxy attorney. He discovered that you and your greedy wife were actively exploring shady legal avenues to strip him of his independent medical rights. You were plotting to have him declared mentally incompetent so you could seize his financial assets and lock him in a cheap state-run care facility long before his time. The very second Leon realized you were actively conspiring to steal his autonomy and ruin his final years, he hired my firm. We have been waiting patiently for half a year for you to make your fatal financial mistake. You handed him the perfect weapon yesterday morning. The full crushing weight of his monumental failure crashed down on Kendrick's shoulders. He was not the apex predator he believed himself to be. He had been the clueless prey for half a year, happily and arrogantly walking directly into a carefully constructed slaughterhouse. He looked down at the thick contract resting on the cold metal table. The choices presented to him were brutal and unforgiving, but there was no real debate to be had. He could not survive a decade in federal prison. He was a soft, pampered corporate executive who threw a tantrum when his morning espresso was slightly too cold. The reality of a concrete cell terrified him beyond rational thought. He picked up the sleek, black pen Gregory provided. His hand shook so violently that the black ink blotted on the thick paper before he could even form the first letter of his name. He swallowed a massive lump of tears, the salt burning the back of his throat as a few drops fell onto the contract. He signed his name on the dotted line, officially erasing his future inheritance, surrendering the remaining stolen funds, and permanently severing his relationship with the only man who had ever truly loved and protected him. Gregory snatched the contract off the table the very second the ink dried. He placed it securely inside his briefcase, snapped the heavy lock shut, and stood up without a single word of comfort. "Have a nice life," Gregory said firmly, walking out of the interrogation room and leaving Kendrick entirely alone in the harsh fluorescent light. Kendrick sat there for a long time, his mind racing with panic. He had avoided a federal prison sentence, but he had absolutely nothing else to his name. He needed someone to lean on. He needed a warm place to sleep tonight. He desperately pulled his damp, cracked phone from his suit pocket. He pulled up Heather's contact profile. He prayed she had cooled down from the eviction chaos. He prayed she would remember their wedding vows and let him crash at whatever upscale hotel she had undoubtedly booked with her emergency credit cards. He pressed the call button and pressed the speaker to his ear, his heart pounding with frantic, pathetic hope. He waited anxiously for the familiar ringing sound, closing his eyes tightly and rehearsing the pathetic, groveling apology he was going to deliver the second she picked up. He was ready to beg on his knees if he had to, but the ringing sound never came. Instead, the phone line clicked with a sharp, dead, static tone. A cold, automated, mechanical voice filled his ear, stripping away his final shred of hope. "The number you have reached is no longer in service. Please check the number and try your call again." Kendrick pulled the phone away and stared at the cracked screen in pure, unadulterated disbelief. He dialed the number again, his thumb shaking. The exact same mechanical voice repeated the devastating message. Kendrick stumbled out of the federal detention center and into the harsh, unforgiving reality of the city streets. With his phone permanently disconnected and absolutely zero cash in his muddy pockets, he could not even call a taxi. He was forced to walk the grueling 6 miles back to the gated suburban community. His expensive custom-tailored Italian leather shoes designed for carpeted boardrooms and not concrete sidewalks blistered his feet with every agonizing step. His damp suit clung to his shivering frame, making him look exactly like the vagrants he used to actively mock on his way to work. When he finally dragged his exhausted body around the familiar corner of the upscale cul-de-sac, the sight that greeted him made his heart completely stop. The towering mountain of luxury furniture, expensive electronics, and designer clothing that the Apex removal crew had carelessly dumped on the front lawn earlier that morning had been utterly ravaged. It looked as though a violent tornado had ripped directly through a high-end department store. The expensive velvet sofa cushions were scattered across the mud, torn open by the harsh elements. The heavy mahogany dresser drawers were pulled completely out of their frames and tossed aside into the bushes. It was not just the chaotic, messy aftermath of a brutal corporate eviction. Someone had deliberately and systematically ransacked his remaining worldly possessions while he was locked away in a cold federal holding cell. He scrambled frantically into the massive pile of debris, tossing aside wet silk dress shirts and broken crystal whiskey glasses. His bleeding hands dug aggressively toward the heavy wooden jewelry armoire that used to sit proudly in their master bedroom. He pulled it from beneath a ruined mattress. The doors were wide open and the velvet-lined drawers were completely empty. Every single one of his expensive luxury watches, the limited edition chronographs he had purchased with his massive corporate bonuses, were completely gone. He quickly turned his attention to the pile of Heather's belongings. Her extensive, heavily curated collection of imported designer handbags, the flawless diamond necklaces, the heavy platinum bracelets, and all the high-value liquid assets that could have easily been sold to secure a cheap apartment or buy a hot meal were entirely missing. Even the small hidden fireproof lockbox where he kept $10,000 in emergency cash had been violently pried open with a crowbar and emptied to the very last cent. As he frantically dug his raw, blistered fingers into the wet dirt and ruined fabrics, a dark shadow fell over him. He looked up, gasping for air. It was Mr. Davis, the notoriously nosy and judgmental neighbor from across the street who had always despised Kendrick's loud, arrogant weekend parties. Mr. Davis stood safely on the pristine concrete sidewalk, holding a large golf umbrella, looking down at Kendrick with a toxic mixture of absolute pity and pure disgust. He reached into his dry jacket pocket, pulled out a crumpled piece of thick stationery paper, and tossed it carelessly onto the wet grass right next to Kendrick's muddy knees. "Your lovely wife left in a major hurry about 2 hours ago," Mr. Davis stated flatly, his voice devoid of any neighborly warmth. "She flagged down a premium black car service, loaded about 6 heavy suitcases into the trunk, and told me to toss this garbage to you if you ever showed your face around this neighborhood again. Mr. Davis turned around on his heel and walked briskly back to his dry, warm house, leaving Kendrick completely alone in the damp, biting cold. Kendrick reached out with a violently shaking hand and picked up the expensive cream-colored paper. It was Heather's personalized custom stationery. The handwriting was rushed sharp and entirely devoid of any residual marital affection. He read the short, brutal message written in thick black ink. "I do not sleep with broke men, and I certainly do not sleep with homeless felons. You lied to me about your wealth. You ruined my social standing. Do not ever try to contact me again. My lawyer will mail the official divorce papers to whatever homeless shelter you end up in tonight. Goodbye, Kendrick." The brutal, unfiltered reality of Heather's true parasitic nature finally slammed into his thick skull with the force of a wrecking ball. She did not love him. She had never loved him for a single second of their entire relationship. She loved the unlimited platinum credit cards, the exclusive country club memberships, and the grand illusion of endless financial security he had provided. This was her established, calculated pattern, a ruthless cycle of exploitation she had perfected long before she ever crossed paths with him. She was a professional, highly efficient parasite who attached herself to wealthy, arrogant men, aggressively drained their resources to elevate her own lavish lifestyle, and instantly detached the very second the money supply dried up. Kendrick had deliberately ignored all the glaring red flags. He had aggressively ignored my stern warnings when they first started dating 3 years ago. I told him she was looking at his wallet and not his heart, but he called me a jealous, bitter old man. He was so blinded by her superficial beauty and her fake high society pedigree that he eagerly financed her entire existence using my hard-earned money. Now that his bank accounts were frozen by the FBI and his prestigious career was permanently destroyed, he had officially outlived his usefulness to her. She had stripped the carcass clean and fled to find her next wealthy victim, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the devastating legal consequences of his own theft. The piece of cream-colored stationery slipped from his trembling fingers, landing face up in a dirty, muddy puddle. Kendrick collapsed entirely. His weak knees gave out and he fell forward, his chest slamming onto the mountain of ruined, soaked belongings. He blindly clutched a torn velvet cushion to his chest, his knuckles turning stark white as his mind violently replayed the events of the last 48 hours. The sheer velocity of his downfall was impossible to process. In the span of just 2 days, he had lost his beautiful trophy wife. He had lost his sprawling luxury mansion. He had lost his prestigious, high-paying Wall Street career, and he had nearly lost his absolute freedom to the federal justice system. But most devastatingly, he had permanently lost his father. He had arrogantly traded the only man who had ever genuinely loved and protected him for a pile of stolen digital cash and a shallow woman who abandoned him the second the check bounced. The immense psychological pressure became way too much for his fragile, pampered mind to handle. Kendrick buried his dirty face into the wet fabric of the ruined cushion and screamed. It was not a normal cry of sadness or a simple shedding of tears. It was a primal, guttural roar of pure agony and absolute crushing despair. He screamed like a wild, cornered animal caught in a brutal, inescapable trap of its own making. His voice cracked and echoed painfully through the quiet, wealthy cul-de-sac, bouncing off the massive houses he used to believe he belonged in. He punched the wet ground repeatedly, tearing his fingernails on the hidden rocks and roots, sobbing uncontrollably as the monumental weight of his catastrophic failure crushed the last remaining pieces of his arrogant soul. He was utterly broken, stripped of his pride, his fake wealth, and his family. He was no longer a hotshot financial executive. He was just a dirty, homeless man crying in a pile of wet garbage on a lawn he did not own, as if the universe itself decided to actively participate in his absolute final humiliation. The dark gray clouds above finally broke wide open. A heavy, freezing, torrential downpour began to wash over the neighborhood, instantly soaking Kendrick to the bone and turning the front lawn into a muddy, miserable swamp. He did not even move to seek shelter under the ruined furniture. He just laid there in the dirt, letting the freezing rain beat down relentlessly on his back. Through the heavy, blinding curtain of the torrential rain, the bright white LED headlights of a vehicle slowly cut through the gloom. A sleek, pristine, ultra-luxury black sedan glided silently down the street, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt. It pulled up to the curb and came to a smooth, deliberate stop directly in front of the miserable, sobbing man. The sleek black, ultra-luxury sedan sat idling perfectly still in the torrential downpour. The heavy rain battered aggressively against the polished roof and the dark-tinted windows. But inside the vehicle there was only absolute, pristine silence. The dark, heavily tinted rear passenger window began to glide down with a smooth, barely audible mechanical hum. The freezing wind and the driving rain instantly whipped into the climate-controlled cabin, blowing cold droplets across the expensive leather seats, but the man sitting in the back did not flinch or move to protect himself from the harsh elements. It was me. I was not wearing the faded flannel shirts and the grease-stained denim jeans Kendrick was so accustomed to seeing me wear around his house. I was dressed completely impeccably in a custom-tailored charcoal gray wool suit that cost significantly more than his monthly mortgage payment. A crisp white dress shirt and a dark silk tie completed the total transformation. I looked absolutely nothing like the broken, pathetic old mechanic he had thrown out onto the street just 48 hours ago. I looked exactly like the wealthy, powerful director of a ruthless corporate holding company. I leaned slightly toward the open window, resting my arm firmly on the plush leather armrest. My face was a rigid mask of absolute, unforgiving granite. My eyes cold and dark like a freezing winter glacier locked directly onto the pathetic, shivering creature lying helplessly in the muddy grass. Kendrick lifted his heavy, soaking wet head from the ruined velvet cushion he was clutching. Through the blinding sheet of heavy rain and his own uncontrollable heaving tears, his bloodshot eyes struggled desperately to focus on the luxury vehicle that had just pulled up. When he finally registered my face staring back at him from the luxurious leather interior, a violent jolt of electricity seemed to shoot straight through his exhausted, freezing body. He let out a desperate, strangled gasp that sounded barely human. He scrambled quickly onto his hands and knees, completely ignoring the sharp debris, the broken wood, and the shattered glass scattered dangerously across the muddy lawn. He crawled frantically through the deep freezing puddles like a desperate, starving animal clawing toward a sudden, miraculous lifeline. He reached the side of the heavy sedan and threw his entire body weight against the thick metal door. His filthy, bleeding fingers desperately gripped the chrome trim of the open window, leaving thick, ugly streaks of dark brown mud smeared across the pristine glass and the incredibly expensive black paint job. "Dad!" he wailed loudly, his voice cracking and breaking violently under the immense, crushing weight of his absolute desperation. "Dad, please help me. Save me. I am so sorry." I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong about absolutely everything. You were right about Heather. You were completely right about the money and her true intentions. She left me. She took everything of real value, and she completely abandoned me in the dirt when I needed her most. I lost my job at the investment firm. I lost my financial licenses. The federal agents came to my office and completely destroyed my entire professional career in front of everyone. I have absolutely nothing left in this world but the wet, ruined clothes on my back. I am freezing cold, I am starving, and I am so scared. Please do not leave me out here in this terrible storm." He sobbed hysterically, his chin resting heavily on the wet window frame, as the relentless rain plastered his matted hair tightly to his forehead. He looked absolutely wretched, a complete and total shell of the arrogant Wall Street executive who had ruthlessly mocked my blue-collar existence his entire adult life. "I will do anything," he pleaded, his voice escalating into a frantic, high-pitched shriek of pure agony. "I will work at a fast food restaurant. I will scrub dirty toilets. I will pay you back every single cent I tried to steal, even if it takes me the rest of my natural life to do it. Just let me get in the car right now. Please take me home with you. We can start over. I can be a much better son. I swear on my life I will be the perfect son to you from now on. Just do not let me die out here in the street like a discarded stray dog. Please, Dad. I am begging you on my knees to save me one last time." I sat perfectly still, letting the freezing rain hit my face and soak the shoulder of my expensive custom suit jacket. I did not reach out to wipe the thick mud from his crying face. I did not extend a warm, comforting hand to pull him out of the freezing, violent storm. Instead, I slowly and deliberately looked down at my own two hands resting quietly on my tailored lap. I stared intently at the deep, permanent scars crisscrossing my worn knuckles. I looked at the dark, stubborn grease stains forever embedded in the deep lines of my rough palms. These were the exact hands that had bled and blistered for 40 long years just to provide a safe roof over his head. These were the hands that had tirelessly repaired heavy broken engines late into the freezing night to pay for his elite university education, his expensive tailored clothes, and his entirely unearned sense of massive superiority. I searched the deepest, darkest corners of my soul for a single fleeting spark of fatherly mercy. I searched frantically for the biological instinct that usually compels a parent to unconditionally protect their child from the harsh, brutal cruelty of the outside world. There was absolutely nothing left inside me. The deep well of my compassion was completely and permanently dry. Every single ounce of love I ever held for the boy crying hysterically at my window had been aggressively and permanently murdered the exact moment he forged my signature to steal my life savings and threw my suitcases into the mud. I finally realized the brutal, undeniable truth that I had avoided for years. Kendrick was not a misunderstood victim of circumstance or bad external influence. He was a malignant, highly toxic tumor that had been greedily feeding off my life force for decades. He was a ruthless parasite who would drain me until I was nothing more than an empty, hollow corpse. I knew with absolute terrifying clarity that the only way to survive, the only way to truly live the rest of my life in peace, wealth, and dignity was to permanently and aggressively cut the tumor out. The long era of blind, foolish parental forgiveness was officially and permanently over. I slowly turned my head and locked my cold, dead eyes directly onto his frantic, weeping, mud-covered face. Back at me, desperately searching my stoic back at me, desperately searching my stoic face for a tiny glimmer of hope, a small hidden sign that I was finally going to unlock the door and pull him into the warm, safe, comfortable cabin of the luxury car. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us until my face was just a few inches away from his muddy, tear-streaked cheeks. I spoke with a voice so incredibly calm, so deeply and profoundly devoid of any human emotion or lingering affection that it cut right through the howling wind and the loud torrential rain like a freshly sharpened blade. "You do not get to call me your father ever again," I stated clearly, pronouncing every single syllable with the heavy crushing and absolute weight of an executioner's heavy wooden gavel. A true son does not forge legal banking documents to steal $250,000 from the very man who broke his physical back to feed him. A true son does not throw an old, defenseless man out into the freezing rain just to impress a shallow, gold-digging wife who never loved him. You traded my entire life and my future security for a luxury sports car and a handful of highly volatile digital currency. You made a highly calculated, incredibly ruthless financial decision to utterly destroy my entire existence so you could temporarily elevate your own false social status. Therefore, I am going to treat you exactly how a ruthless financial executive expects to be treated in the corporate world. Kendrick's eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror as the devastating permanent finality of my heavy words finally pierced through his thick, arrogant skull. He opened his mouth wide to beg again, but his throat seized and no sound came out. "I am not your father," I continued, my voice echoing like a dark death knell in the stormy, humid air. "And you are most certainly not my son. You are nothing more than a highly toxic, severely failed financial investment. I foolishly held on to a massively depreciating asset for far too long. I let my weak, foolish emotions dictate my primary business strategy, and it almost cost me absolutely everything I owned. But I am a very fast learner, Kendrick. I know exactly how to recognize a total, unrecoverable loss." I looked him up and down one last time, taking in his ruined designer suit, his filthy, muddy face, and his utter, spectacular destruction. And today, I finally cut my losses permanently. Without breaking my icy eye contact for a single fraction of a second, I reached over to the leather armrest and firmly pressed the automated window switch. The heavy tinted privacy glass immediately began to glide upward with a smooth, undeniable, and powerful mechanical force. Kendrick panicked wildly, his dirty fingers scrambling and slipping against the rising glass, but he was ultimately forced to snatch his bleeding hands away before the window completely crushed his fingers into the solid metal doorframe. The thick glass sealed shut with a soft final click instantly and completely drowning out his pathetic, muffled, desperate screams. The hired driver shifted the heavy luxury sedan into drive and accelerated smoothly away from the curb, splashing a wave of dirty puddle water over Kendrick and leaving the ruined, broken man kneeling completely alone in the freezing, relentless mud. Inside the quiet, warm, climate-controlled cabin, My cellular phone vibrated sharply inside my tailored breast pocket. I pulled it out and looked down at the glowing digital screen. A highly secure priority notification from the Central Federal Bank flashed brightly across the display. The entire stolen sum of $250,000 had been successfully and completely extracted from the frozen cryptocurrency exchange and fully refunded directly into my newly established, heavily encrypted offshore safety account. The ambient lighting of the five-star Grand Plaza Hotel bar cast a warm golden glow over the polished mahogany counter and the expensive crystal glassware. Heather sat gracefully on a velvet bar stool, perfectly adjusting the neckline of her stolen designer dress. She was a seasoned predator back in her natural hunting ground, completely unfazed by the spectacular destruction of her marriage just hours prior. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the affluent room before locking onto her absolute perfect target. He was a silver-haired businessman in his late 50s, nursing a neat bourbon and wearing a rose-gold luxury watch that practically screamed generational wealth. He was exactly the kind of high-net-worth savior she needed to desperately replace the total financial collapse of her previous life. Heather smoothly slid onto the empty stool right next to him. She crossed her long legs, ensuring the slit of her dress caught his immediate attention, and signaled the bartender with a practiced flick of her wrist. She confidently ordered a glass of vintage Cabernet Sauvignon that cost nearly $100 a pour. It was a massive bar tab she had absolutely no intention of paying herself. She flashed the older man a perfectly practiced, vulnerable smile, instantly initiating the predatory dance she had perfected over a decade of ruthless social climbing. The wealthy businessman introduced himself as Richard, a corporate logistics chief executive officer who traveled extensively and was clearly lonely enough to entertain the sudden attention of a beautiful, much younger woman. Heather did not waste a single second with meaningless small talk. She smoothly transitioned into the carefully fabricated, highly tragic narrative she had constructed during her frantic ride away from the ruined mansion. She lowered her gaze, letting a single, perfectly timed tear well up in her vibrant green eyes. "It has just been the most devastating week of my entire life, Richard," Heather whispered, her voice trembling with a masterful blend of fake exhaustion and engineered heartbreak. "I recently discovered that the man I married was a complete financial sociopath. He secretly drained our joint accounts, forged my signature on countless federal loan documents, and left me holding the bag for his massive illegal gambling debts. I lost my beautiful estate, my vehicles, and my entire sense of security in the span of 48 hours. I am just trying to figure out how to rebuild my life from absolutely nothing." Richard leaned closer, completely hooked by the toxic bait. His eyes softened with genuine misguided pity. The protective masculine instinct she was actively trying to trigger took over his rationale immediately. "That is absolutely horrific," he murmured, placing a comforting, warm hand over her cold fingers resting on the mahogany bar. "How could any man do something so incredibly vile to a woman like you? You must be completely terrified." Heather nodded bravely, dabbing the corner of her eye with a cocktail napkin. "I am terrified," she admitted softly, leaning her shoulder slightly into his personal space. "But I am also a survivor. I just need a little bit of stability. Someone who actually understands how to protect a woman instead of exploiting her." Richard puffed out his chest, his ego swelling rapidly under her expert manipulation. He ordered another round of the incredibly expensive vintage wine, silently signaling that he was more than willing to cover her exorbitant tab. "Well, Heather, you do not have to worry about a single thing tonight," Richard said with a suave, reassuring smile. "I am staying in the penthouse suite here for the remainder of the week. We can have a nice long dinner, and if you need a safe, luxurious place to figure things out, you are more than welcome to stay with me." Heather felt her heart soar with dark, predatory triumph. She had done it. In less than 30 minutes, she had successfully secured a new, wealthy host. She was minutes away from walking into a penthouse ready to completely reset her parasitic cycle and drain a brand new bank account. She offered him a dazzling, grateful smile, her mind already calculating the maximum credit limit of his platinum cards. What Heather did not know, and what her massive, blinding arrogance prevented her from ever noticing, was the unassuming man in a gray suit sitting quietly in the shadowy corner booth of the hotel bar. He was a highly specialized, elite private investigator operating on my unlimited financial retainer. I had hired him the exact moment Kendrick signed the total asset surrender contract in the police interrogation room. I was not going to let Heather simply slither away into the night to find a new victim and rebuild her toxic life. I knew her parasitic nature intimately. I knew she would instantly run to the nearest luxury watering hole to latch on to another wealthy man the second she realized Kendrick was completely broke and facing federal prison. She thought she had successfully escaped the devastating fallout of the eviction because her name was not directly on the fraudulent wire transfers. But I do not leave loose ends, and I absolutely do not allow my enemies to quietly plant new roots anywhere in my city. She had spent years looking down at my calloused hands, treating me like absolute garbage in a house my money paid for. She was the poisonous whisper in my son's ear, aggressively pushing him to steal my retirement fund so she could buy a new luxury sports car. I instructed my private investigator to shadow her every single move, wait until she found a new vulnerable target, and then ruthlessly sever her only remaining lifeline. Richard raised his crystal glass to toast their newly established connection, but before the expensive wine could touch his lips, his smartphone vibrated aggressively against the solid wood bar counter. A priority email notification flashed across his locked screen. He set his drink down and picked up the device, expecting a late-night corporate update from his executive board. Heather watched him, maintaining her sweet, innocent smile, patiently waiting for him to finish so they could head up to the penthouse and seal the deal. But as Richard opened the encrypted anonymous email and began to read the attached documents, the warm, comforting color completely drained from his mature face. The message contained a highly detailed, devastatingly accurate digital dossier compiled by my investigator. It included the official 72-hour eviction notice bearing her legal name and the high-definition photographs of her violently screaming and attacking the tow truck driver on her ruined lawn. It also contained a comprehensive, undeniable background check detailing her long-documented history of bankrupting her previous romantic partners through systematic credit fraud. The final attachment was a crystal-clear audio file recovered from Kendrick's devices. It was a recording of Heather viciously mocking my blue-collar background and aggressively demanding that her husband forge the banking documents to steal my life savings. Richard sat completely frozen, his eyes darting frantically across the damning digital evidence. The sweet, vulnerable victim sitting next to him instantly morphed into a terrifying, toxic predator. He slowly lowered the phone and turned to look at Heather. The gentle, protective warmth in his eyes had been completely replaced by an intense, overwhelming disgust. He looked at her as if she were a highly venomous snake that had just tried to bite his neck. Richard did not demand an explanation or ask if the documents were real. He did not yell or cause a public scene in the elegant bar. He simply stood up from his velvet bar stool, adjusted his expensive suit jacket, and looked down at her with pure, unadulterated contempt. "You are an absolutely disgusting human being," he stated coldly, his voice dripping with pure revulsion. "Have a terrible life, Heather." Without another word, Richard turned his back and walked briskly out of the hotel bar, leaving her completely stunned, utterly exposed, and entirely alone. Heather sat frozen in pure shock as her wealthy savior disappeared into the crowded hotel lobby. Before she could even attempt to process the catastrophic failure of her perfect plan, the stern bartender stepped forward and placed a sleek black leather folder directly in front of her. It was the final bill for the multiple glasses of vintage wine she had consumed, totaling over $300. Heather felt the blood rush from her face. She reached into her stolen designer purse, realizing with absolute paralyzing horror that her credit cards were entirely maxed out and her cash was completely gone. The hotel manager, noticing her frantic, empty-handed panic, crossed his arms and signaled the front desk to immediately dial the local police for felony theft of services. Kendrick stood hunched over a massive stainless steel industrial sink, the harsh fluorescent lights of the cramped kitchen beating down on his exhausted frame. A stained, grease-covered apron was wrapped tightly around his waist, offering little protection from the foul-smelling dishwater splashing continuously onto his ruined dress shirt. His once pristine hands, which had only ever typed on high-end keyboards and signed million-dollar contracts, were now completely submerged in lukewarm water filled with floating food scraps and congealed animal grease. He grabbed a cheap plastic scraper and aggressively attacked the hardened remains of a burnt meatloaf crusted onto a chipped ceramic plate. The pungent, nauseating odor of stale frying oil, rotting garbage, and cheap bleach assaulted his nostrils with every shallow breath he took. The intense, suffocating heat radiating from the nearby industrial stoves made the cramped, windowless kitchen feel like a blistering underground furnace. Sweat dripped relentlessly down his forehead, stinging his bloodshot eyes and mixing with the grime on his face. He was no longer the untouchable Wall Street executive commanding absolute respect in glass boardrooms. He was just another faceless, minimum-wage dishwasher slaving away in the grimy, neglected back room of a rundown roadside diner on the absolute worst side of town. His wet, trembling fingers suddenly lost their grip on the heavy ceramic plate. It slipped from his slick hands and crashed violently onto the hard tile floor, shattering into dozens of jagged white pieces. The sharp, unmistakable noise cut directly through the chaotic clatter of the busy kitchen. Instantly, the heavy swinging doors burst open and the diner manager stormed into the dish pit. He was a large, imposing man with a permanent scowl, a thick stained shirt, and absolutely zero tolerance for mistakes from his lowest-paid employees. "What in the world is wrong with you?" the manager roared, his booming voice echoing off the tiled walls and drawing the immediate judgmental stares of the line cooks. "That is the third plate you have broken this week, Kendrick. I am docking that directly from your pathetic paycheck. You are the absolute slowest, clumsiest dishwasher I have ever had the profound misfortune of hiring. You move like you have never worked a real day in your entire miserable life. Clean up this massive mess right now before I fire you on the spot and throw you out into the street." Kendrick swallowed the thick, bitter lump of pride in his throat. He did not talk back. He did not threaten the man with a corporate lawsuit or puff out his chest with his usual Wall Street arrogance. He simply dropped to his bruised knees on the slippery, wet floor and began picking up the sharp ceramic shards with his bare, pruning hands. As he crawled on the filthy ground, gathering the broken pieces of the cheap plate, a crushing wave of profound, devastating irony washed over his entire being. He knew this cramped, greasy diner intimately well. He knew the cheap vinyl booths and the sticky laminated menus in the front dining room. Exactly 1 year ago, I had invited him to this very establishment to celebrate my 68th birthday. I had chosen this specific place because it was a simple, honest diner that served the best cherry pie in the entire city. Kendrick had shown up 45 minutes late wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit and completely refused to sit down at the table. He had stood in the middle of the crowded dining room and loudly, aggressively humiliated me. He told me the place was a disgusting, unsanitary dump meant only for peasants, losers, and financial failures. He said he would rather starve than eat a single bite of food prepared in such a pathetic, low-class establishment. He threw a $50 bill at my chest, told me to buy myself a decent meal for once in my pathetic life, and walked out the door without even wishing me a happy birthday. Now, 12 short months later, he was the pathetic peasant on his hands and knees, frantically scrubbing the floors of the exact same restaurant he had so ruthlessly despised. The universe possessed a dark, intensely punishing sense of humor, and Kendrick was finally the ultimate punchline. He gathered the broken pieces into a plastic bucket, keeping his head bowed in absolute submission as the manager continued to bark degrading orders at him. He was completely trapped in a suffocating nightmare of his own making. For his entire adult life, Kendrick had actively and loudly looked down upon anyone who worked with their hands to make a living. He viewed physical manual labor as a definitive mark of severe intellectual failure and societal worthlessness. He openly mocked construction workers, mechanics, and service industry staff, genuinely believing his ability to manipulate digital spreadsheets and trade stocks made him a vastly superior human being. He used to tell Heather over expensive dinners that people who scrubbed floors and washed dishes simply lacked the mental capacity and the ambition to be successful. Now that toxic, blinding arrogance had brutally backfired, crashing down on him with the unforgiving weight of a solid concrete wall. The grueling physical labor was completely destroying his soft, pampered body. His lower back screamed in agonizing pain from standing hunched over the low sink for 12 continuous hours a day. The harsh industrial chemicals in the cheap dish soap had stripped the protective skin from his hands, leaving them raw, cracked, and constantly bleeding. He was experiencing the absolute, unfiltered humiliation of the lowest rung of society. He was entirely invisible, a disposable human machine yelled at by angry cooks and mercilessly berated by a ruthless boss who did not care about his past. The crushing reality of blue-collar survival, the very life I had quietly endured for decades to put a silver spoon in his mouth, was now his permanent, inescapable reality. By the time his grueling shift neared its end, Kendrick was completely exhausted and entirely broke. The massive legal fees required to keep him out of federal prison and the immediate asset seizures executed by the FBI had left him with absolutely nothing. He had not eaten a proper warm meal in 2 full days. Surviving solely on the discarded dinner rolls and half-eaten French fries, he secretly scraped off the dirty customer plates before tossing them into the soapy water. His stomach growled fiercely, a sharp, agonizing cramp twisting his insides and making him physically lightheaded. He needed cash immediately just to afford a cheap bus ticket to the overcrowded homeless shelter across town, otherwise he would be sleeping under a highway overpass in the freezing cold. He slowly pushed a gray plastic utility cart into the main dining room to collect a stack of dirty bus tubs. The dinner rush had finally cleared out, leaving the restaurant mostly empty and quiet. As he wiped down a sticky corner booth with a damp rag, his desperate eyes locked onto a small stack of green bills resting under a half-empty coffee cup. It was a $20 cash tip left for Maria, a hard-working single mother who had been serving tables all night to feed her children. Kendrick stared at the money, his moral compass completely obliterated by his intense gnawing hunger and absolute blinding desperation. He checked his surroundings frantically, his heart hammering against his ribs. Maria was across the room wiping down the lunch counter with her back completely turned. The aggressive manager was nowhere to be seen. Kendrick extended his raw, shaking hand toward the table. He snatched the $20 bill from the vinyl surface and quickly shoved it deep into the front pocket of his filthy, grease-stained apron. He felt a brief, sickening rush of relief, thinking he had successfully secured his survival for one more miserable night. But before he could even turn back to his utility cart to resume cleaning, a massive, heavy hand clamped down violently onto his shoulder. Kendrick froze, his blood turning entirely to ice in his veins. He was spun around aggressively, his feet slipping on the slick floor. The burly manager stood towering over him, his face contorted with pure, unadulterated rage. "You miserable, thieving rat!" The manager roared, his booming voice echoing loudly through the empty diner and causing the remaining staff to stop dead in their tracks. "I saw exactly what you just did from the kitchen window. You are stealing hard-earned tip money right off the tables from my girls." Kendrick panicked instantly, violently shaking his head and stammering pathetic, incoherent excuses, trying desperately to pull away from the manager's iron grip. It was a complete mistake, Kendrick begged, his voice high and entirely desperate, tears welling in his eyes. "I was just cleaning the table. I was going to give the money directly to her. Please do not call the police." The manager did not listen to a single word of his pathetic, scrambling lies. He grabbed Kendrick aggressively by the back of his greasy apron and the collar of his ruined dress shirt. He frog-marched him violently through the main dining room, pushed forcefully through the heavy metal kitchen doors, and kicked open the back exit with his heavy boot. With one massive, forceful shove, the manager threw Kendrick bodily out of the restaurant. Kendrick stumbled forward, unable to catch his balance, and crashed hard into the filthy, wet concrete of the back alley. He landed directly next to a row of overflowing, foul-smelling garbage dumpsters, scraping his knees and elbows on the rough pavement. "Do not ever show your miserable, thieving face around my restaurant again," the manager bellowed into the night, slamming the heavy metal security door shut and locking the deadbolt tight. Kendrick was left groveling in the dark, freezing, stinking alleyway amongst the rotting food, having officially and completely lost the very last pathetic lifeline he had left in the world. While Kendrick was quite literally eating garbage in a freezing, foul-smelling alleyway, I was sitting comfortably in a plush leather executive chair on the top floor of the city's most exclusive, ultra-modern high-rise. I held a heavy silver fountain pen, the cool metal resting perfectly in my hand, its tip gliding smoothly across the thick, crisp parchment of a final closing document. I was officially purchasing a breathtaking $1.5 million luxury penthouse, paying the entire massive sum in unencumbered liquid cash. The massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows directly behind me offered an absolutely unparalleled panoramic view of the sprawling downtown skyline. From up here, the city looked like a brilliant sea of sparkling diamonds, a vast, undeniable empire that I was finally claiming as my own. The sheer, staggering contrast between the dirty, cramped spare room my son had viciously forced me to live in and this sprawling, magnificent architectural masterpiece was extraordinary. I pressed the pen firmly onto the signature line, officially transferring the pristine 3,000-square-foot property directly into the fully protected portfolio of Leon Holdings, LLC. Sitting directly across the sleek imported glass desk was the listing broker, a slick, fast-talking man named Bradley. Bradley wore a flashy designer suit, too much cologne, and a predatory smile, the exact kind of aggressive real estate agent who made a highly lucrative career out of exploiting wealthy but supposedly uninformed buyers. He looked at my gray hair, my dark skin, and my calm, quiet demeanor, and he immediately assumed I was just a lucky lottery winner or an ignorant old man who had stumbled into sudden, unearned wealth. He arrogantly assumed I did not understand the complex, rigid intricacies of commercial real estate law. Bradley smoothly slid a secondary closing invoice across the glass desk, tapping his manicured finger on a highly inflated hidden administrative fee strategically buried near the absolute bottom of the page. It was a blatant, unauthorized commission bump of an extra $40,000, cleverly disguised as a mandatory escrow processing surcharge. He offered me a patronizing fake smile, confidently expecting me to blindly sign the extortionary document without reading a single word, just like my foolish son had done 3 years ago. I did not pick up the pen. I picked up the invoice, scanned the highly manipulative legal phrasing, and locked my cold, piercing eyes directly onto Bradley's smug face. My voice was dangerously calm, echoing ominously off the high ceilings of the luxury suite. You are attempting to levy a non-standard, undisclosed secondary commission fee disguised as a Title IX processing surcharge. I stated, my tone sharp and entirely unforgiving. Under the current state real estate regulations, specifically Section 402, any unapproved deviation from the originally signed listing agreement constitutes direct, undeniable financial fraud. You are actively attempting to extort $40,000 from a senior citizen by hiding illegal margin bumps in standard closing documents. Bradley's fake smile vanished instantly, completely replaced by a pale, terrified grimace. He stammered frantically, waving his hands aggressively, attempting to play the massive fraud off as a simple clerical error made by his junior administrative staff. I did not let him finish his pathetic, scrambling lie. I leaned forward, my physical presence suddenly dominating the entire room. If you do not remove this fraudulent charge and produce a corrected, legally compliant invoice within the next 3 minutes, I will not only completely terminate this massive cash transaction, but I will personally forward this exact document to the State Real Estate Commission. I will file a formal complaint for predatory lending practices and severe ethical violations, and I will personally ensure your highly lucrative broker license is permanently revoked by the end of this fiscal quarter. Do you understand me clearly, Bradley? The broker swallowed hard, thick sweat beating rapidly on his pale forehead. He aggressively snatched the fraudulent paper off the desk, his hands shaking violently as he pulled out the correct, legally binding invoice from his leather folder. He had tried to play a highly dangerous game with a seasoned veteran, and he had been brutally, humiliatingly crushed in less than 60 seconds. Bradley was completely shocked by my sharp, undeniable financial literacy, but my extensive economic knowledge was not something I was simply born with. It was the hard-earned, meticulously crafted result of 4 grueling decades of relentless, aggressive self-education. While other men my age spent their evenings drinking at local bars or wasting their meager paychecks on frivolous entertainment, I was sitting alone at a greasy kitchen table studying complex tax codes, corporate real estate law, and advanced investment strategies. I spent 40 long years scouring discount bookstores, buying outdated economic textbooks, and aggressively analyzing the precise methods wealthy people use to legally protect and exponentially multiply their assets. I absolutely refused to let anyone exploit my lack of a formal university education. I recognized very early on that the financial world is a viciously predatory place designed specifically to completely strip the working class of their hard-earned money. I armed my mind with the exact same legal and financial weapons the elite upper class use to maintain their dominant power. Nobody was ever going to cheat me out of a single dime, not a slick real estate broker, and certainly not my own greedy, entirely entitled son. The real estate transaction was finalized perfectly without another word of objection, and I officially took possession of the breathtaking penthouse later that very same afternoon. The expansive apartment was entirely flawless, featuring heated marble floors, custom automated ambient lighting, and a massive private terrace that overlooked the bustling, vibrant heart of the financial district. I walked slowly through the grand living space, the heavy, comforting silence of the empty rooms bringing me a profound, unmatched sense of absolute peace. There was no ungrateful son constantly demanding my money to fund his fake lifestyle. There was no entitled daughter-in-law loudly complaining about my presence in the hallways. There was only pure, unadulterated freedom. I walked into the sprawling master bathroom and stopped directly in front of the massive illuminated vanity mirror. I looked at the reflection of the powerful, uncompromising man I had finally allowed myself to openly become. I raised my left wrist and unclasped the cheap silver-plated watch I had worn every single day for the last 5 years. Kendrick had bought it for me during a frantic last-minute Christmas shopping trip, a thoughtless generic gift he picked up at a discount department store. He had handed it to me without even bothering to wrap it, acting as if he had generously bestowed a priceless artifact upon a desperate beggar. I stared at the worthless piece of metal for a fleeting second, feeling absolutely zero sentimental attachment to the object or the man who gave it to me. I dropped it directly into the stainless steel trash can, the cheap metal clattering loudly and pathetically against the bottom. I then reached into my secured leather travel bag and pulled out a heavy velvet-lined mahogany box. I opened it and extracted a stunning, immaculate solid gold Rolex day date. It was a massive, incredibly expensive luxury timepiece I had purchased for myself years ago, but had kept completely hidden in a safe deposit box to meticulously maintain the illusion of a struggling, poor mechanic. I fastened the heavy, cold gold securely around my wrist. It fit perfectly, catching the brilliant light of the bathroom. It was the ultimate, undeniable, tangible symbol of my true worth, my vast, hidden wealth, and my absolute, unyielding power. As I admired the gleaming gold watch on my wrist, the high-tech private intercom system in the hallway chimed with a soft, elegant, and welcoming tone. The luxury building's dedicated concierge informed me that a highly secure hand-delivered package had just arrived exclusively for my new residence. I walked to the private elevator landing and retrieved a thick, premium cream-colored envelope sealed with rich, heavy burgundy wax. I broke the elegant seal and pulled out a heavy gold-embossed card. It was an exclusive, highly coveted personal invitation to join the most elite, ultra-luxury golf and country club in the entire state. It was a private, heavily guarded society reserved strictly for the absolute top tier of the wealthy elite, a place where men like Kendrick desperately begged to be allowed inside. My new life of absolute power and luxury had officially begun. Far away from the pristine, heated marble floors of my new luxury penthouse, Kendrick was currently occupying a hard, cracked plastic chair inside the city's main public library. He sat hunched over a sticky, heavily used public computer terminal in the designated free internet zone. He looked absolutely wretched, a complete and terrifying departure from the polished financial executive he was just a few days ago. His once immaculate designer suit was now permanently stained with dark grease-sour dishwater and the foul, lingering residue of the restaurant alleyway dumpster he had been violently thrown into. He had not showered in days, and a thick, patchy, unkempt beard obscured his normally sharp jawline. The other patrons in the quiet library instinctively moved their chairs away from him, visibly repulsed by the potent, undeniable stench of failure, stale sweat, and physical desperation radiating intensely from his body. He was restricted to a strict 45-minute browsing session on the outdated public machine, a humiliating digital timer counting down loudly in the corner of the smudged monitor. His filthy, trembling fingers hovered nervously over the greasy plastic keyboard. He was a man holding onto a single microscopic thread over a bottomless, terrifying abyss. He typed in the web address for his decentralized cryptocurrency exchange, the keystrokes echoing loudly in the silent, sterile room. This specific digital wallet was his absolute last remaining hope in the entire world. When he had initially executed the fraudulent wire transfer of my $250,000 retirement fund, he had immediately and aggressively diverted a significant portion of that stolen cash into a highly volatile, completely unregulated, decentralized digital currency project. Because those specific funds were instantly converted into untraceable offshore crypto tokens before the federal freeze officially hit his domestic banking portfolio, the FBI had not been able to immediately claw them back. It was the only financial asset he possessed that had not been locked down, seized by the government, or utterly destroyed by his catastrophic downfall. He stared at the spinning loading wheel on the slow, outdated library network, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid, his chest heaving with mounting anxiety. He desperately needed a miracle, He prayed to a god he never believed in that the extremely aggressive bull market he had bragged so loudly about at his champagne brunch had miraculously multiplied his hidden investment. He formulated a frantic, desperate, incredibly detailed plan in his exhausted mind. If the coin had doubled or tripled in value over the last few days, he could cash out quietly through a decentralized digital mixer. He would secure a massive pile of untraceable physical cash, buy a highly convincing fake passport on the black market, and flee the country entirely to start a brand new life in a place without extradition treaties. He could completely escape the looming, terrifying threat of a decade in federal prison. He could hire a shady, aggressive defense lawyer and maybe even track down Heather to arrogantly prove he was still a financial genius capable of generating massive wealth out of thin air. He imagined pulling up to her in a rented sports car, waving stacks of cash in her face and forcing her to deeply regret ever abandoning him on that muddy lawn. The heavy, suffocating burden of his total, catastrophic ruin rested entirely on the fragile digital numbers about to populate on the cracked, dirty monitor. He squeezed his eyes shut for a brief, agonizing second, actively bargaining with the universe, begging desperately for just one lucky break to completely reverse the horrific nightmare his life had become. His entire existence, his very survival on the unforgiving streets depended solely on this high-risk, purely speculative digital gamble. He opened his bloodshot eyes, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his brow, and stared intensely at the screen, waiting for his salvation to load. In those agonizing, drawn-out seconds, while the outdated browser struggled to load the heavily encrypted financial dashboard, a distinct, haunting memory violently pierced through Kendrick's panicked, fragile mind. It was my voice. He clearly remembered a heated, disrespectful argument we had years ago in the kitchen of my old house. He had been excitedly pitching a different, highly suspicious investment scheme to me, aggressively mocking my slow, steady, and highly conservative financial strategies. I had looked him dead in the eye and delivered a stern, unforgiving, and deeply truthful warning. There is absolutely no such thing as free, easy money in this world, Kendrick, I had told him with rigid, unyielding authority. Anyone promising you massive overnight wealth without grueling, tangible labor is either an absolute fool or a highly calculated predator actively preparing to completely slaughter you. Real wealth is built carefully, brick by brick, not through highly speculative, entirely unregulated digital gambling. He had aggressively rolled his eyes at me back then, loudly calling me an obsolete, financially illiterate dinosaur who simply did not understand the modern global economy. Now my prophetic, heavily grounded words echoed relentlessly in his hollow, defeated mind like a dark, inescapable curse, brutally mocking his supreme, blinding arrogance. The slow, agonizing progress bar finally completed its cycle. The decentralized exchange dashboard materialized fully on the glowing screen. Kendrick leaned in extremely close, his nose almost physically touching the dirty monitor, his frantic eyes searching aggressively for the total portfolio balance. The large, bold numbers loaded directly at the top of the page. $0.00. Kendrick froze completely. He blinked rapidly, absolutely convinced the cheap library computer was experiencing a massive system error. He frantically refreshed the browser, hitting the key over and over with his dirty, trembling fingers. The page reloaded instantly. The balance remained at absolute zero. He clicked aggressively into the specific token profile, his panic skyrocketing into pure, unadulterated terror. A bright red warning banner flashed across the top of the decentralized exchange platform. The anonymous developers behind the flashy, highly hyped cryptocurrency project had executed a classic, devastating rug pull. They had artificially inflated the value, completely drained the entire liquidity pool in the middle of the night, and permanently vanished with millions of dollars in stolen investor funds. He stared at the market chart showing a massive vertical red candle dropping straight down to the absolute bottom. The token's value had violently crashed by 99.9%. The digital currency he had bet his entire life, his absolute freedom, and his very survival on was completely mathematically worthless. The staggering, impossible reality hit him with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. The very last fraction of his stolen money was entirely gone. He had absolutely nothing left in the entire world. Something inside Kendrick's fragile, severely damaged psyche finally and violently snapped. He let out a deafening, blood-curdling shriek of pure, unfiltered agony that shattered the strict silence of the public library. He raised his fists high above his head and slammed them violently down onto the plastic keyboard, shattering the keys and sending small plastic pieces flying aggressively across the wooden desk. The violent, unhinged outburst triggered an immediate aggressive response. Two large, heavily built library security guards sprinted across the reading room. They did not issue a verbal warning or attempt to de-escalate the situation. They grabbed Kendrick roughly by his shoulders, twisted his arms painfully behind his back, and aggressively dragged his kicking, screaming body away from the ruined computer terminal. They hauled him forcefully through the main glass doors and shoved him violently down the concrete front steps. As Kendrick tumbled hard onto the filthy city sidewalk, a strong gust of wind picked up a piece of discarded trash from the gutter. A bright pink paper flyer whipped through the cold air and slapped directly onto his wet face. He peeled it off his cheek and read the bold black text. It was a local advertisement for a downtown emergency homeless shelter. Miles away from Kendrick's public breakdown, Heather was experiencing her own terrifying descent into absolute poverty. She dragged her heavy, exhausted feet through the cracked, garbage-lined sidewalks of the city's most notorious slum district. The elegant high society predator who had confidently strutted through five-star hotel lobbies just days ago was now completely unrecognizable. Her stolen designer dress was stained and wrinkled from sleeping in cheap, unsanitary transit hubs after fleeing the hotel authorities. Her perfectly styled blonde hair hung in greasy, tangled strands around her pale, gaunt face. She had not eaten a proper meal since Richard abandoned her at the bar, and the severe lack of sleep made her green eyes look sunken and hollow. She clutched a cheap plastic grocery bag containing the very last of her stolen possessions. She stopped in front of a dingy, dimly lit pawn shop. The flickering neon open sign cast a sickly red glow over the heavily barred bulletproof windows. It was a filthy, desperate place designed for the lowest rung of society, a place she would have previously refused to even look at from the window of her luxury SUV. She pushed open the heavy security door, a harsh electronic buzzer announcing her arrival into the cramped, stale-smelling shop. Heather approached the scratched, bulletproof glass counter with trembling hands. Behind the thick barrier sat a large, unkempt man with a thick gray beard and a stained undershirt, aggressively chewing a wad of tobacco. He did not greet her. He simply stared with cold, dead eyes, waiting for her to produce whatever stolen or desperate item she was trying to liquidate. Heather reached deep into the pocket of her ruined dress and pulled out the massive, glittering engagement ring she had violently thrown at Kendrick just a few days ago. She had gone back to the muddy lawn and secretly retrieved it after Kendrick had been hauled away by the police, convinced it was her ultimate emergency safety net. She slid the heavy platinum-looking band through the narrow metal transaction slot. "I need to sell this immediately," Heather demanded, trying to force her old arrogant country club tone into her raspy, exhausted voice. "It is a flawless 3-carat brilliant cut diamond set in pure platinum. My ex-husband paid over $80,000 for it at an exclusive boutique in Europe. I need at least $10,000 in cash today to secure a long-term suite at a respectable hotel." The pawn shop owner did not seem impressed by her lofty, aggressive claims. He had heard every single desperate sob story and grandiose lie the city had to offer. He picked up the ring with his thick, calloused fingers, completely unimpressed by its massive size or its blinding sparkle under the harsh overhead lights. He pulled a specialized jeweler's loop from his shirt pocket, wedged it firmly into his right eye socket, and switched on a high-intensity halogen desk lamp. He held the stone directly under the bright beam, slowly rotating it to examine the internal facets, the light refraction, and the metal stamping on the inner band. Heather stood impatiently, tapping her dirty foot against the scuffed linoleum, already calculating exactly which upscale hotel she would book the second he handed over the thick stacks of cash. She was ready to escape this disgusting neighborhood and get back to her rightful place in the world. Suddenly, the quiet hum of the pawn shop was completely shattered. The large owner let out a loud, booming, guttural laugh. His chest heaved with genuine, uncontrollable amusement as he lowered the ring from the light. He laughed so hard he had to wipe a tear from his wrinkled eye, his deep chuckles echoing mockingly off the cramped, inventory-filled walls. Heather felt a cold, sharp spike of absolute panic pierce her chest. "What is so funny?" she snapped defensively, her voice cracking with rising anxiety. "That is a certified premium diamond. You are looking at a small fortune. Stop laughing and give me my cash right now." The brutal, undeniable truth of Kendrick's entire existence was about to completely destroy her. Kendrick was a man built entirely on a flimsy foundation of massive unearned ego and absolute staggering financial deception. He possessed a desperate, pathetic need to constantly project an image of immense, limitless wealth to his peers, even though his actual bank accounts were heavily leveraged and entirely dependent on the money he siphoned from me. He bought into the illusion of success so deeply that he actually believed his own lies. But underneath the tailored suits and the loud bragging, he was exceptionally cheap and incredibly deceitful. He never actually spent his own money on anything of genuine lasting value for Heather. Every single expensive gift he ever presented to her with a grand theatrical flourish was nothing more than a highly convincing, meticulously sourced counterfeit. He bought fake designer handbags from overseas black markets and presented them in authentic boxes. He leased luxury cars instead of buying them. He built an entire spectacular kingdom entirely out of cheap hollow cardboard just to feed his own massive narcissism. The pawnshop owner finally caught his breath, tossing the massive ring carelessly onto the scratched metal counter like a piece of worthless plastic. "Lady," he chuckled, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, "I do not know what kind of idiot you married, but he played you for an absolute fool. That is not a flawless diamond. That is not even a low-grade lab-grown diamond. That is a cheap, industrially manufactured cubic zirconia stone glued into a basic stainless steel band coated in a fake platinum finish. The entire thing probably cost him $200 on a discount website. The absolute maximum I can give you for this shiny piece of garbage is $50, and that is only because I feel sorry for you." Heather felt the entire world violently spin around her. Her knees buckled, and she had to grip the metal counter just to stay standing. $50. She had completely sold her soul, destroyed my family, and participated in federal wire fraud, all for a man who gave her a worthless piece of shiny glass. The illusion of her grand, wealthy life was totally and completely obliterated. She snatched the fake ring, grabbed the single $50 bill the owner slid through the transaction slot, and stumbled blindly out of the shop. She used the pathetic sum to secure a filthy, roach-infested room at a terrifying roadside motel, the absolute lowest place she had ever been in her life. She left her plastic bag inside and walked to a nearby gas station to buy a cheap bottle of water. When she returned to the motel an hour later, she found a heavy steel padlock clamped aggressively over her door handle. A handwritten note taped to the wood stated she was locked out due to a prior guest's unpaid damages that the corrupt manager decided to suddenly blame on her. She had absolutely no money left to argue. She was locked out, starving, and totally abandoned. Heather sank to the filthy concrete walkway outside the locked motel door. The freezing night air bit through her thin, ruined dress. She had exhausted every single manipulative trick, every fake smile, and every wealthy contact she possessed. She was completely broken, reduced to nothing more than a shivering, desperate beggar. With her hands shaking violently from the freezing cold and intense hunger, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her cracked cellular phone. She opened her contacts, scrolled past the blocked numbers of her former elite friends, and pressed the call button for the one man she had brutally despised. She dialed Leon. The floor-to-ceiling windows of my new penthouse offered a spectacular, uninterrupted panoramic view of the city glowing brilliantly against the dark night sky, but my attention was focused entirely on my grip. I stood in the exact center of the sprawling living room, the heated, imported marble floors perfectly smooth and comforting beneath my feet, and took a slow, measured practice swing with a brand-new, custom-fitted titanium golf club. The heavy metal head sliced through the quiet, climate-controlled air with a satisfying, highly precise swoosh. I was meticulously preparing for my very first weekend at the elite, ultra-exclusive country club, finally enjoying the luxurious, peaceful retirement I had actively earned and fiercely protected from predators. The absolute pristine tranquility of my sanctuary was suddenly interrupted by the sharp, persistent vibration of my smartphone resting on the sleek glass coffee table nearby. I did not rush to answer it like an anxious servant. I slowly completed my follow-through, admiring my confident form in the reflection of the massive windows before walking over and picking up the device. The caller ID flashed a number I had not saved, but the area code was instantly recognizable. It was the same cheap prepaid carrier network used by individuals who had exhausted all their premium mainstream options. I let it ring until it went directly to voicemail. Seconds later, a second unknown number called. I let that one ring out as well, completely unbothered. A small red notification bubble appeared on my high-resolution screen indicating 2 new audio messages were waiting for me. I tapped the glowing screen and pressed play on the very first message. The audio was immediately filled with the harsh crackling sound of heavy, freezing wind and frantic, hysterical sobbing. It was Heather. Her previously haughty, venomous voice, the same voice that had viciously mocked my blue-collar background and demanded my immediate eviction, was completely and utterly gone. It was replaced by the pathetic, high-pitched, trembling whine of a cornered rat. "Leon, please, please do not delete this," she gasped, choking violently on her own desperate tears. "I know I have absolutely no right to call you. I know I treated you horribly and disrespected your home. I was so incredibly wrong about everything. Kendrick completely manipulated me from the very beginning. He lied to me about his finances, and he violently forced me to go along with his horrible plans to take your retirement money. I am completely locked out of a disgusting bug-infested motel. It is freezing cold outside, and I have absolutely nothing left to my name. I am so hungry, Leon. Please, you are a good, honorable man. You know I always respected you deep down in my heart. Just send me enough money for a cheap hotel room and a single hot meal. I will pay you back every single cent. I will do whatever you want. Please do not leave me out here to freeze to death." The message ended with a pathetic, drawn-out wail. She was still actively trying to manipulate reality, attempting to shift the entire blame onto her ex-husband, while pretending she possessed a shred of moral decency. I felt absolutely nothing but a deep, freezing wave of pure disgust. I tapped the second audio file without a single flinch. This one was much quieter, entirely lacking the theatrical, loud, performative sobbing of his ex-wife. It was Kendrick. His voice sounded incredibly weak, hollow, and utterly, permanently defeated. It was the raspy, broken whisper of a man who had finally hit absolute, undeniable rock bottom. "Dad, it is me," Kendrick murmured, the background noise of heavy city traffic threatening to drown his pathetic voice out entirely. "I am using a borrowed prepaid phone outside a gas station. I know you completely hate me. I know I deserve absolutely everything that is happening right now. I lost my corporate job, my wife left me in the mud, and I just got physically thrown out of the restaurant where I was washing dirty dishes. The downtown homeless shelter was completely full tonight. I am sleeping on the freezing concrete behind a commercial dumpster. Dad, I have not eaten a single piece of real food in 2 entire days. My stomach hurts so badly I cannot even stand up straight. I am not asking for a place to live or for you to ever forgive me. I am just begging you as a human being to buy me a hot meal, a cheap burger, a slice of pizza, absolutely anything. I am so terribly cold, and I am starving to death. Please, Dad, just one meal. I am so sorry." The recording clicked off with a sharp beep, leaving the massive penthouse in absolute pristine silence once again. I slowly lowered the phone to my side and looked down at my own 2 hands. I traced the deep, jagged white scar running directly across my left thumb, a permanent physical reminder of a heavy steel engine block slipping and violently crushing my hand during a brutal double shift 20 years ago. I had willingly suffered through that excruciating physical agony, specifically so Kendrick could go on a fancy middle school ski trip and fit in seamlessly with the wealthy, privileged kids he so desperately wanted to emulate. I had completely sacrificed my own body, my own youth, and my own personal comfort to build an unshakable foundation for a boy who ultimately saw me as nothing more than an expendable walking bank account. The very last microscopic flicker of parental weakness, that deep biological urge to blindly rescue my offspring from the cold jaws of reality, was permanently and completely incinerated. People who only dial your phone number when their pockets are entirely empty and their stomachs are fiercely growling have absolutely no right to ever invoke the sacred title of family. They were not my family. They were highly toxic, incredibly dangerous parasites who had finally been forcefully detached from their host, and I was entirely cured of the disease. I turned my back on the massive windows and walked over to the sleek, custom-built mahogany wet bar situated in the corner of my living room. I reached for a heavy, intricately cut crystal decanter filled with an incredibly rare 50-year-old single malt Scotch whiskey. It was a premium imported bottle that cost significantly more than the average mechanic makes in 3 entire months, a supreme, unapologetic luxury I had purchased to officially celebrate my new life of absolute, unhindered wealth. I poured a generous, smooth measure of the rich, dark amber liquid into a heavy crystal tumbler. The large ice cube clinked softly against the glass, a highly civilized, elegant sound that sharply and perfectly contrasted the pathetic, muddy desperation of the people shivering violently on the dirty streets far below my tower. I lifted the heavy glass to my nose, inhaling the complex, smoky, oak-filled aroma, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The expensive liquor burned smoothly and perfectly down my throat, leaving a warm, magnificent, and truly royal flavor on my palate. It tasted like absolute, undeniable victory. It tasted like untouchable, permanent power. Holding the expensive crystal glass firmly in my left hand, I picked up my smartphone with my right. I opened the visual voicemail application and stared at the 2 digital audio files taking up unnecessary space on my pristine device. I did not hesitate or second-guess myself for a single fraction of a second. I firmly pressed the bright red delete all button. The pathetic, begging, manipulative voices of my past were instantly and permanently erased from digital existence. I navigated quickly to my recent call log, selected both of the unknown prepaid numbers, and engaged the permanent block feature. They would never be able to reach my line, leave a message, or disrupt my incredible peace ever again. The heavy iron door to my life was violently slammed shut, and the deadbolt was permanently welded closed. I set the empty crystal glass down gently on the cool marble counter and walked over to my spacious, illuminated walk-in closet. I pulled a flawlessly tailored dark navy cashmere overcoat from its heavy wooden hanger and slipped it smoothly over my broad shoulders. The luxurious high-end fabric provided instant comforting warmth against the evening chill. I meticulously adjusted the solid gold Rolex on my wrist, grabbed my leather wallet, and headed straight for the private elevator. I stepped out of my secure luxury building and onto the bustling, brightly lit streets of the city's most affluent district, preparing to enjoy a highly extravagant multi-course dinner at an exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of my luxury residential building and was immediately greeted by the crisp, freezing night air of the city. My private chauffeur stood impeccably dressed with his hands clasped together, waiting patiently next to a gleaming midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom. He stepped forward instantly, holding a massive black umbrella to expertly shield me from the light freezing drizzle that had just begun to fall over the affluent downtown district. I nodded in silent appreciation and slid into the spacious, heated leather back seat. The heavy door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly silencing the chaotic noise of the city streets. I settled into the plush leather upholstery, enjoying the whisper-quiet ride as the massive luxury vehicle navigated smoothly through the vibrant, neon-lit avenues. We drove past towering skyscrapers, premium boutiques, and exclusive social clubs, a world I had always observed from the outside, but now comfortably owned. After a short, elegant drive, the chauffeur pulled up to the pristine curb in front of the most exclusive, highly coveted Michelin-starred restaurant in the entire state. The exterior of the building was an absolute masterpiece of classic architecture, adorned with brilliant golden lighting and an ornate, heavy brass entrance. A uniformed valet rushed forward, immediately opening my door with a deep, respectful bow. I stepped out onto the damp pavement, the luxurious hem of my dark navy cashmere overcoat brushing lightly against the cold wind. I felt entirely powerful, completely in control of my destiny. As I stood on the pristine sidewalk, meticulously adjusting the lapels of my expensive coat and preparing to walk into the warm, inviting atmosphere of the grand dining room, a harsh grating sound suddenly caught my attention. It was the loud, abrasive scrape of a heavy wooden push broom dragging aggressively against the rough, wet concrete of the street gutter. I glanced over toward the dark, narrow alleyway positioned just a few yards away from the restaurant's main entrance. A lone sanitation worker was laboring fiercely in the freezing drizzle. He was wearing an oversized, incredibly filthy neon orange reflective safety vest that was heavily stained with dark sludge motor oil and urban grime. He was violently shoving a massive foul-smelling plastic garbage bin along the wet curb, using his broken broom to sweep up soggy discarded food wrappers, wet cigarette butts, and rotting debris. The worker paused his grueling, exhausting labor, clearly distracted by the smooth arrival of my $500,000 vehicle. He leaned heavily against his wooden broom handle, his chest heaving as he panted for breath, and slowly lifted his heavy head to look at the source of the high society commotion. The harsh, bright glow of the restaurant's exterior floodlights cut directly through the misty rain and illuminated his face perfectly. It was Kendrick. He was completely and utterly unrecognizable from the slick, arrogant financial executive who used to strut proudly around his luxury mansion. His face was gaunt, hollow, and covered in a thick, permanent layer of dark city dirt. His hair was a matted, greasy mess plastered tightly to his skull by the freezing rain. His hands, entirely exposed to the biting winter cold, were raw, blistered, and wrapped in cheap, torn industrial gloves. He looked like a man who had violently aged 20 years in a matter of a few short weeks. He was utterly broken, entirely consumed and chewed up by the unforgiving machinery of the absolute lowest rung of society. When his bloodshot, sunken eyes finally focused and locked directly onto my face, the heavy broom slipped entirely from his weakened grasp and clattered loudly onto the wet concrete. The sheer staggering magnitude of the contrast between us in that exact moment was nothing short of absolute poetic perfection. It was a flawless, undeniable physical manifestation of universal justice. We were standing less than 30 feet apart, yet we were occupying two entirely different, irreconcilable universes. I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of luxury, draped in premium cashmere and solid gold, commanding immediate respect and authority simply by existing. I had built my empire through 4 decades of grueling, honest physical labor, unmatched patience, and a ruthless willingness to protect my boundaries when the time finally came. He, on the other hand, was drowning in the literal gutter. He had aggressively attempted to build his entire life on a fragile, toxic foundation of emotional manipulation, boundless greed, unearned entitlement, and the blatant criminal theft of my life savings. He genuinely thought he could outsmart the world by stealing from the very hands that fed him and sheltered him. Instead, his monumental arrogance had aggressively fast-tracked his descent into the absolute miserable bottom of the societal barrel. The man who had once sneered at blue-collar workers, who had openly and viciously mocked my grease-stained hands and my mechanic uniform, was now forced to scrape rotting garbage off the freezing street just to survive the night. The universe had violently corrected itself, restoring the natural order with devastating, uncompromising accuracy. The ruthless parasite had been thoroughly crushed, and the honest laborer had ascended to the throne. The heavy, suffocating silence between us seemed to completely drown out the chaotic noise of the busy city traffic and the steady patter of the freezing rain. 4 eyes remained locked in an intense, unbroken stare. Kendrick's entire body began to shake violently, vibrating with a toxic mixture of absolute freezing cold and profound, paralyzing shock. He slowly raised his raw, blistered hands, his fingers desperately clutching a heavy, foul-smelling black trash bag filled with rotting restaurant waste. He looked at my pristine, custom-tailored suit. He looked at the massive, gleaming Rolls-Royce idling softly at the curb. He looked at the heavy, solid gold Rolex catching the brilliant golden light on my wrist. His fragile mind visibly shattered right in front of me as the catastrophic reality of his colossal failure crushed whatever tiny, pathetic fragment of his ego still remained. He realized in that agonizing second that I was a multimillionaire, and he had thrown away his entire inheritance for a fake diamond ring and a worthless crypto scam. His chapped, bleeding lips parted slowly. He struggled painfully to pull cold air into his lungs. I watched his mouth move, forming the distinct shape of a single agonizing word. Dad. No sound came out. The word was completely swallowed by the freezing wind and his own overwhelming, paralyzing shame. It was a silent, pathetic plea from a broken creature begging for a savior that absolutely no longer existed. I did not feel a single drop of pity. My heart rate did not increase. My facial expression remained entirely unchanged, locked permanently in a mask of cold, unyielding granite. I did not offer him a smile of vindication, nor did I show him a scowl of anger. He was simply not worth the biological energy required to alter my facial muscles. I maintained absolute piercing eye contact for one final, devastating second, to ensure he fully understood his complete and permanent insignificance. Then, with deliberate, slow precision, I raised my arm and smoothly adjusted the crisp white cuff of my expensive dress shirt. I turned my back to him, moving with absolute grace and absolute indifference. I walked straight toward the heavy gilded doors of the Michelin-starred restaurant. The impeccably dressed doorman bowed highly respectfully and pulled the golden handle open, welcoming me warmly into the luxurious sanctuary inside. I did not look back over my shoulder. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I left him standing in the freezing rain with his garbage. I stepped into the grand, beautifully illuminated dining room, the rich aroma of roasted meats, expensive truffles, and fine wine instantly warming my senses. The polite maitre d' approached immediately, addressing me by name, and led me to the absolute best private table in the house, situated perfectly beside a massive crystal-clear bay window. A highly attentive sommelier immediately approached and poured a generous glass of a rare vintage Bordeaux. I sank into the plush velvet chair, picked up the heavy crystal glass, and raised it slightly, offering a silent, triumphant toast to the beautiful, undeniable reality of my absolute freedom. I took a smooth, rich sip, looking out through the thick, soundproof glass. The bright streetlights outside blurred softly in the cold, freezing drizzle. In the dark, distant background, a small, pathetic figure in a dirty orange vest slowly bent down, picked up a broken wooden broom, and went back to sweeping the filthy gutter. The nightmare was officially over. My new life had just begun. The ultimate lesson here is that true power does not need to announce itself loudly. Kendrick and Heather confused my quiet humility for weakness and my fatherly patience for ignorance. They believed that wearing expensive suits and driving flashy cars made them inherently superior. But real wealth is built on hard work, immense discipline, and a strong foundation of respect. When you violently bite the hand that feeds you, you do not just lose a single meal, you lose your entire future. Arrogance will always blind you to the massive traps you are eagerly walking into, and the universe has a ruthless way of balancing the scales. Never underestimate a quiet man who has spent his entire life learning to survive in the shadows. If you enjoyed this story of absolute justice, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you would have done in my position.